Speech by Queen Elizabeth I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Speech given to the House of Commons on the 30th of November, 1601, by Queen Elizabeth I. Mr. Speaker, we have heard your declaration and perceive your care of our estate. I do assure you there is no prince that loves his subjects better, or whose love can countervail our love. There is no jewel, be it of never so rich a price, which I set before this jewel, I mean your love. For I do esteem it more than any treasure or riches, for that we know how to prize, but love and thanks I count invaluable. And though God has raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves. This makes me that I do not so much rejoice that God hath made me to be a queen, as to be a queen over so thankful a people. Therefore I have cause to wish nothing more than to content the subject, and that is a duty which I owe. Neither do I desire to live longer days than I may see your prosperity, and that is my only desire. And as I am that person still yet, under God, hath delivered you, and so I trust by the almighty power of God that I shall be his instrument to preserve you from every peril, dishonour, shame, tyranny, and oppression, partly by means of your intended helps, which we take very acceptably, because it manifesteth the largeness of your good loves and loyalties unto your sovereign. Of myself I must say this. I was never any greedy, scraping grasper, nor a straight, fast-holding prince, nor yet a waster. My heart was never set on any worldly goods. What you bestow on me, I will not hoard it up, but receive it to bestow on you again. Therefore render unto them, I beseech you, Mr. Speaker, such thanks as you imagine my heart yieldeth, but my tongue cannot express. Mr. Speaker, I would wish you and the rest to stand up, for I shall yet trouble you with longer speech. Mr. Speaker, you give me thanks, but I doubt me I have greater cause to give you thanks than you me, and I charge you thank them of the lower house from me, for had I not received a knowledge from you, I might have fallen into the lapse of an error, only for the lack of true information. Since I was queen, yet did I never put my pen to any grant, but that upon pretext and semblance made unto me. It was both good and beneficial to the subject in general, though a private profit to some of my ancient servants, who had deserved well at my hands. But the contrary being found by experience, I am exceedingly beholden to such subjects as would move the same at first. And I am not so simple to suppose but that there be some of the lower house whom these grievances never touched. I think they spake out of zeal to their countries, and not out of spleen or malevolent affection, as being parties grieved. That my grants should be grievous to my people, and depressions to be privileged under colour of our patents, our kingly dignity shall not suffer it. Yea, when I heard it, I could give no rest unto my thoughts until I had reformed it. Shall they, think you, escape unpunished that have oppressed you, and have been respectless of their duty and regardless our honour? No, I assure you. Mr. Speaker, were it not more for conscience' sake than for any glory or increase of love that I desire, these errors, troubles, vexations, and oppressions, done by these varlets and lewd persons, not worthy of the name of subjects, should not escape without condign punishment. But I perceive they dealt with me like physicians, who ministering a drug make it more acceptable by giving it a good aromatical savour, or when they give pills to gild them all over. I have ever used to set this last judgment day before mine eyes, and so to rule, as I shall be judged to answer before a higher judge. And now if my kingly bounties have been abused, and my grants turned to the hurt of my people, contrary to my will and meaning, and if any in authority under me have neglected or perverted what I have committed to them, I hope God will not lay their culps and offences in my charge. I know the title of a king is a glorious title, but assure yourself that the shining glory of princely authority hath not so dazzled the eyes of our understanding, but that we well know and remember that we are also to yield an account of our actions before the great Judge. To be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it. For myself, I was never so much enticed with the glorious name of a king or royal authority of a queen, as delighted that God hath made me his instrument to maintain his truth and glory, and to defend his kingdom, as I have said, from peril, dishonour, tyranny, and oppression. There will never queen sit in my seat with more zeal to my country, care to my subjects, and that will sooner with willingness venture her life for your good and safety than myself. For it is my desire to live nor reign no longer than my life and reign shall be for your good. And though you have had, and may have, many princes more mighty and wise sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any that will be more careful and loving. For I, O Lord, what am I, whom practices and perils past should not fear? Or what can I do? That I should speak for your glory, God forbid. And I pray to you, Mr. Comptroller, Mr. Secretary, and you of my council, that before these gentlemen go to their countries, you bring them all to kiss my hand. End of speech. Recording by Rhonda Federman.
Part 1 of Speech by Edmund Burke.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org.
Speech given to the House of Commons on the 22nd of March, 1775, by Edmund Burke.
On Conciliation with America, by Edmund Burke, 1775. I hope, sir, that notwithstanding the austerity of the chair, your good nature will incline you to some degree of indulgence towards human frailty. You will not think it unnatural that those who have an object depending, which strongly engages their hopes and fears, should be somewhat inclined to superstition. As I came into the house full of anxiety by the event of my motion, I found, to my infinite surprise, that the grand penal bill, by which we had passed sentence on the trade and sustenance of America, is to be returned to us from the other house. I do confess, I could not help looking on this event as a fortunate omen. I look upon it as a sort of providential favor, by which we are put once more in possession of our deliberative capacity upon a business so very questionable in its nature, so very uncertain in its issue. By the return of this bill, which seemed to have taken its flight forever, we are at this very instant nearly as free to choose a plan for our American government as we were on the first day of the session. If, sir, we incline to the side of conciliation, we are not at all embarrassed, unless we please to make ourselves so, by any incongruous mixture of coercion and restraint. We are therefore called upon, as if it were by a superior warning voice, again to attend to America, to attend to the whole of it together, and to review the subject with an unusual degree of care and calmness. Surely it is an awful subject, or there is none so on this side of the grave. When I first had the honor of a seat in this house, the affairs of that continent pressed themselves upon us as the most important and most delicate object of parliamentary attention. My little share in this great deliberation oppressed me. I found myself a partaker in a very high trust, and, having no sort of reason to rely on the strength of my natural abilities for the proper execution of that trust, I was obliged to take more than common pains to instruct myself in everything which relates to our colonies. I was not less under the necessity of forming some fixed ideas concerning the general policy of the British Empire. Something of this sort seemed to be indispensable, in order, amid so vast a fluctuation of passions and opinions, to concentrate my thoughts, to ballast my conduct, to preserve me from being blown about by every wind of fashionable doctrine. I really did not think it safe or manly to have fresh principles to seek upon every fresh mail which should arrive from America. At that period, I had the fortune to find myself in perfect concurrence with a large majority in this House. Bowing under that high authority, and penetrated with the sharpness and strength of that early impression, I've continued ever since without the least deviation in my original sentiments. Whether this be owing to an obstinate perseverance in error, or to a religious adherence to what appears to me truth and reason, it is in your equity to judge. Sir, Parliament, having an enlarged view of objects, made, during this interval, more frequent changes in their sentiments and their conduct than can be justified in a particular person upon the contracted scale of private information. But though I do not hazard anything approaching to a censure on the motives of former parliaments to all those alterations, one fact is undoubted, that under them the state of America has been kept in continual agitation. Everything administered as remedy to the public complaint, if it did not produce, was at least followed by an heightening of the distemper until, by a variety of experiments, that important country has been brought into our present situation. A situation which I will not miscall, which I dare not name, which I scarcely know how to comprehend in the terms of any description. In this posture, sir, things stood at the beginning of the session. About that time, a worthy member of great parliamentary experience, who, in the year 1766, filled the chair of the American Committee with much ability, took me aside, and, lamenting the present aspect of our politics, told me things were come to such a pass that our former methods of proceeding in the House would be no longer tolerated, that the public tribunal, never too indulgent to a long and unsuccessful opposition, would now scrutinize our conduct with unusual severity, that the very vicissitudes and shiftings of ministerial measures, instead of convicting their authors of inconstancy and want of system, would be taken as an occasion of charging us with a predetermined discontent, which nothing could satisfy, whilst we accused every measure of vigor as cruel, and every proposal of lenity as weak and irresolute. The public, he said, would not have patience to see us play the game out with our adversaries. We must produce our hand. It would be expected that those who for many years have been active in such affairs should show that they have formed some clear and decided idea of the principles of colony government, and were capable of drawing out something like a platform of the ground which might be laid for future and permanent tranquility. I felt the truth of what my honorable friend represented, but I felt my situation too. His application might have been made with far greater propriety to many other gentlemen. No man was indeed ever better disposed or worse qualified for such an undertaking than myself. Though I gazed so far into his opinion that I immediately threw my thoughts into a sort of parliamentary form, I was by no means equally ready to produce them. It generally argues some degree of natural impotence of mind, or some want of knowledge of the world, to hazard plans of government except from a seat of authority. Propositions are made, not only ineffectually, but somewhat disreputably, when the minds of men are not properly disposed for their reception. And for my part, I am not ambitious of ridicule, not absolutely a candidate for disgrace. Besides, sir, to speak the plain truth, I have in general no very exalted opinion of the virtue of paper government, nor of any politics in which the plan is to be wholly separated from the execution. But when I saw that anger and violence prevailed every day more and more, and that things were hastening towards an incurable alienation of our colonies, I confess my caution gave way. I felt this as one of those few moments in which decorum yields to a higher duty. Public calamity is a mighty leveler, and there are occasions when any, even the slightest chance of doing good must be laid hold on, even by the most inconsiderable person. To restore order and repose to an empire so great and so distracted as ours is merely an attempt, an undertaking that would ennoble the flights of the highest genius and obtain pardon for the efforts of the meanest understanding. Struggling a good while with these thoughts, by degrees I felt myself more firm. I derived at length some confidence, for in other circumstances usually produces timidity. I grew less anxious, even from the idea of my own insignificance. For, judging of what you are by what you ought to be, I persuaded myself that you would not reject a reasonable proposition because it had nothing but its reason to recommend it. On the other hand, being totally destitute of all shadow of influence, natural or adventitious, I was very sure that if my proposition were futile or dangerous, if it were weakly conceived or improperly timed, that there was nothing exterior to it of power to awe, dazzle, or delude you. You'll see it just as it is, and you'll treat it just as it deserves. The proposition is peace. Not peace through the medium of war, not peace to be hunted through the labyrinth of intricate and endless negotiations, not peace to arise out of universal discord fomented from principle in all parts of the empire, not peace to depend on the juridical determination of perplexing questions or the precise marking the shadowy boundaries of a complex government. It is simple peace, sought in its natural course and in its ordinary haunts. It is a peace sought in the spirit of peace and laid in principles purely pacific. I propose, by removing the ground of the difference and by restoring the former unsuspecting confidence of the colonies in the mother country, to give permanent satisfaction to your people, and, far from a scheme of ruling by discord, to reconcile them to each other in the same act and by the bond of the very same interest which reconciles them to British government. Idea is nothing more. Refined policy ever has been the parent of confusion, and ever will be so as long as the world endures. Plain good intention, which is easily discovered at the first view, as fraud is surely detected at last, is, let me say, of no mean force in the government of mankind. Genuine simplicity of heart is a healing and cementing principle. My plan, therefore, being formed upon the most simple grounds imaginable, might disappoint some people when they hear it. It has nothing to recommend it to the pruriency of curious ears. There is nothing at all new and captivating in it. It has nothing of the splendor of the project which has been lately laid upon your table by the noble lord in the blue ribbon. It does not propose to fill your lobby with squabbling colony agents who will require the interposition of your mace at every instant to keep the peace amongst them. It does not institute a magnificent auction of finance where captivated provinces come to general ransom by bidding against each other until you knock down the hammer and determine a proportion of payments beyond all the powers of algebra to equalize and settle. The plan which I presume to suggest derives, however, one great advantage from the proposition and registry of that noble lord's project. The idea of conciliation is admissible. First, the House, in accepting the resolution moved by the noble lord, has admitted, notwithstanding the menacing front of our address, notwithstanding our heavy bills of pains and penalties, that we do not think ourselves precluded from all ideas of free grace and bounty. The House has gone farther. It has declared conciliation admissible previous to any submission on the part of America. It even shot a good deal beyond that mark, and has admitted that the complaints of our former mode of exerting the right of taxation were not wholly unfounded. That right, thus exerted, is allowed to have something reprehensible in it, something unwise, or something grievous, since, in the midst of our heat and resentment, we of ourselves have proposed a capital alteration, in order to get rid of what seems so very exceptionable, have instituted a mode that is altogether new, one that is indeed wholly alien from all the ancient methods and forms of Parliament. The principle of this proceeding is large enough for my purpose. The means proposed by the noble lord for carrying his ideas into execution, I think indeed are very indifferently suited to the end, and this I shall endeavor to show you before I sit down. But, for the present, I take my ground on the admitted principle. I mean to give peace. Peace implies reconciliation, and where there's been a material dispute, a reconciliation does in a matter always imply concession on the one part or on the other. In this state of things, I make no difficulty in affirming that the proposal ought to originate from us. Great and acknowledged force is not impaired, either in effect or in opinion, by an unwillingness to exert itself. The superior power may offer peace with honor and with safety. Such an offer from such a power will be attributed to magnanimity. But the concessions of the weak are the concessions of fear. When such a one is disarmed, he is wholly at the mercy of his superior, and he loses forever that time and those chances, which, if they happen to all men, are the strength and resources of all inferior power. Capital leading questions on which you must this day decide are these two. First, whether you ought to concede, and secondly, what your concession ought to be. On the first of these questions we have gained, as I have just taken the liberty of observing to you, some ground. But I am sensible that a good deal more is still to be done. Indeed, sir, to enable us to determine both on the one and the other of these great questions with a firm and precise judgment, I think it may be necessary to consider distinctly the true nature and the peculiar circumstances of the object which we have before us, because after all our struggle, whether we will or not, we must govern America according to that nature and to those circumstances, and not according to our own imaginations, nor according to abstract ideas of right, by no means according to mere general theories of government, the resort to which appears to me, in our present situation, no better than arrant trifling. I shall therefore endeavour, with your leave, to lay before you some of the most material of these circumstances in as full and as clear a manner as I am able to state them. The first thing we have to consider with regard to the nature of the object is the number of people in the colonies. I have taken for some years a good deal of pains on that point. I can by no calculation justify myself in placing the number below 2 millions of inhabitants of our own European blood and colour, besides at least 500,000 others who form no inconsiderable part of the strength and opulence of the whole. This, sir, is, I believe, about the true number. There is no occasion to exaggerate where plain truth is of so much weight and importance. But whether I put the present numbers too high or too low is a matter of little moment. Such is the strength with which population shoots in that part of the world, that state the numbers as high as we will, whilst the dispute continues, the exaggeration ends. Whilst we are discussing any given magnitude, they are grown to it. Whilst we spend our time in deliberating on the mode of governing 2 millions, we shall find we have millions more to manage. Your children do not grow faster from infancy to manhood than they spread from families to communities and from villages to nations. I put this consideration of the present and the growing numbers in front of our deliberation because, sir, this consideration will make it evident to a blunter discernment than yours that no partial, narrow, contracted, pinched, occasional system will be at all suitable to such an object. It will show you that it is not to be considered as one of those minima which are out of the eye and consideration of the law, not a paltry excrescence of the state, not a mean dependent, who may be neglected with little damage and provoked with little danger. It will prove that some degree of care and caution is required in the handling of such an object. It will show that you ought not, in reason, to trifle with so large a mass of the interests and feelings of the human race. You could at no time do so without guilt, and be assured you will not be able to do it long with impunity. The population of this country, the great and growing population, though a very important consideration, will lose much of its weight if not combined with other circumstances. The commerce of your colonies is out of all proportion beyond the numbers of the people. This ground of their commerce, indeed, has been trod some days ago, and with great ability, by a distinguished person at your bar. This gentleman, after 35 years, it is so long since he first appeared at the same place to plead for the commerce of Great Britain, has come again before you to plead the same cause, without any other effective time than that to the fire of imagination and extent of erudition, which even then marked him as one of the first literary characters of his age. He's added a consummate knowledge and the commercial interest of his country, formed by a long course of enlightened and discriminating experience. Sir, I should be inexcusable in coming after such a person with any detail, if a great part of the members who now fill the House had not the misfortune to be absent when he appeared at your bar. Besides, sir, I propose to take the matter at periods of time somewhat different from his. There is, if I mistake not, a point of view from whence, if you will look at this subject, it is impossible that it should not make an impression upon you. I have in my hand 2 accounts. One, a comparative state of the export trade of England to its colonies, as it stood in the year 1704, and as it stood in the year 1772. The other, a state of the export trade of this country to its colonies alone, as it stood in 1772, compared with the whole trade of England to all parts of the world, the colonies included, in the year 1704. They are from good vouchers. The latter period from the accounts on your table, the earlier from an original manuscript of Edmund, who first established an Inspector General's office, which has been ever since his time so abundant a source of parliamentary information. The export trade to the colonies consists of 3 great branches. The African, which terminating almost wholly in the colonies, must be put to the account of their commerce. The West Indian and the North American. All these are so interwoven that the attempt to separate them would tear to pieces the contexture of the whole, and, if not entirely destroy, would very much depreciate the value of all the parts. I therefore consider these three denominations to be what in effect they are: one trade. The trade to the colonies, taken on the export side at the beginning of this century, that is, in the year 1704, stood thus: exports to North America and the West Indies, £483,265. To Africa, £86,665. In the year 1772, which I take as the middle year between the highest and lowest of those lately laid under table, the count was as follows: to North America and the West Indies, £4,791,734. To Africa, £866,398. To which, if you add the export trade from Scotland, which in 1704 had no existence, £364,000. From 500 and odd thousand, it has grown to 6 millions. It has increased no less than 12-fold. This is the state of the colony trade as compared with itself at these two periods within this century, and this is a matter for meditation. But this is not all. Examine my second account. See how the export trade to the colonies alone in 1772 stood in the other point of view, that is, as compared to the whole trade of England in 1704. The whole export trade of England, including that to the colonies in 1704, £6,509,000. Export to the colonies alone in 1772, £6,024,000. The trade with America alone is now within less than £500,000 of being equal to what this great commercial nation, England, carried on at the beginning of this century with the whole world. If I had taken the largest year of those on your table, it would rather have exceeded. But, it will be said, is not this American trade an unnatural protuberance that has drawn the juices from the rest of the body? The reverse. It is the very food that has nourished every other part into its present magnitude. Our general trade has been greatly augmented more or less in almost every part to which it has ever extended, but with this material difference, that of the 6 millions which in the beginning of the century constituted the whole mass of our export commerce, the colony trade was but 1/12 part. It is now, as a part of 16 millions, considerably more than a third of the whole. This is the relative proportion of the importance of the colonies at these two periods, and all reasoning concerning our mode of treating them must have this proportion as its basis, or it is reasoning weak, rotten, and sophistical. Mr. Speaker, I cannot prevail myself to hurry over this great consideration. It is good for us to be here. We stand wearing an immense view of what is and what is past. Clouds indeed and darkness rest upon the future. Let us, however, before we descend from this noble eminence, reflect that this growth of our national prosperity has happened within the short period of the life of man. It has happened within 68 years. There are those alive whose memory might touch the two extremities. For instance, my Lord Bathurst might remember all the stages of the progress. He was, in 1704, of an age at least to be made to comprehend such things. He was then old enough, acta parentum, jam legere, et quo si potu cognoscer virtus. Suppose, sir, that the angel of this auspicious youth, foreseeing the many virtues which made him one of the most amiable, as he is one of the most fortunate men of his age, had opened to him in vision that when in the 4th generation the 3rd prince of the house of Brunswick had sat 12 years on the throne of that nation, which, by the happy issue of moderate and healing counsels, was to be made Great Britain, he should see his son, Lord Chancellor of England, turn back the current of hereditary dignity to its fountain, and raise him to a higher rank of peerage, whilst he enriched the family with a new one. If, amidst these bright and happy scenes of domestic honor and prosperity, the danger should have drawn up the curtain and unfolded the rising glories of his country, and whilst he was gazing with admiration on the then commercial grandeur of England, the genius should point out to him a little speck, scarcely visible in the mass of the national interest, a small seminal principle rather than a foreign body, and should tell him, "Young man, there is America," which at this day serves for little more than to amuse you with stories of savage men and uncouth manners, yet shall, before you taste of death, show itself equal to the whole of that commerce which now attracts the envy of the world. Whatever England has been growing to by progressive increase of improvement, brought in by varieties of people, by succession of civilizing conquests and civilizing settlements, in a series of 1700 years, you shall see as much added to her by America in the course of a single life. If this state of his country had been foretold to him, would it not require all the sanguine credulity of youth and all the fervent glow of enthusiasm to make him believe it? Fortunate man, he has lived to see it. Fortunate indeed, if he lives to see nothing that shall vary the prospect and cloud the setting of his day. Excuse me, sir, if turning from such thoughts I resume this comparative view once more. You have seen it on a large scale. Look at it on a small one. I'll point out to your attention a particular instance of it in the single province of Pennsylvania. In the year 1704, the province called for £11,459 in value of your commodities, native and foreign. This was the whole. What did it demand in 1772? Why, nearly 50 times as much. For in that year, the export to Pennsylvania was £507,909, nearly equal to the export to all the colonies together in the first period. I choose, sir, to enter into these minute and particular details, because generalities, which in all other cases are apt to heighten and raise the subject, have here a tendency to sink it. When we speak of the commerce with our colonies, fiction lags after truth, invention is unfruitful, and imagination cold and barren. So far, sir, as to the importance of the object, in view of its commerce as concerned in the exports from England, if I were to detail the imports, I could show how many enjoyments they procure which deceive the burthen of life, how many materials which invigorate the springs of national industry and extend and animate every part of our foreign and domestic commerce. This would be a curious subject indeed, but I must prescribe balance to myself in a matter so vast and various. I pass, therefore, to the colonies in another point of view, their agriculture. This they have prosecuted with such a spirit that, besides feeding plentifully their own growing multitude, their annual export of grain, comprehending rice, has some years ago exceeded 1,000,000 in value. Of their last harvest, I am persuaded they will export much more. At the beginning of this century, some of these colonies imported corn from the mother country. For some time past, the old world has been fed from the new. The scarcity which you have felt would have been a desolating famine if this child of your old age, with a true filial piety, with a Roman charity, had not put the full breast of its youthful exuberance to the mouth of its exhausted parent. As to the wealth which the colonies have drawn from the sea by their fisheries, you had all that matter fully opened at your bar. You surely thought those acquisitions of value, for they seemed even to excite your envy, and yet the spirit by which that enterprising employment has been exercised ought rather, in my opinion, to have raised your esteem and admiration. And pray, sir, what in the world is equal to it? Pass by the other parts, and look at the manner in which the people of New England have of late carried on the whale fishery. Whilst we follow them among the tumbling mountains of ice, and behold them penetrating into the deepest frozen recesses of Hudson's Bay and Davis's Straits, whilst we are looking for them beneath the Arctic Circle, we hear that they have pierced into the opposite region of polar cold, that they are at the antipodes, and engaged under the frozen serpent of the south, Falkland Island, which seemed too remote and romantic an object for the grasp of national ambition, is but a stage and resting place in the progress of their victorious industry. Nor is the equinoctial heat more discouraging to them than the accumulated winter of both the poles. We know that while some of them draw the line and strike the harpoon on the coast of Africa, others run the longitude and pursue their gigantic game along the coast of Brazil. No sea but what is vexed by their fisheries, no climate that is not witness to their toils. Neither the perseverance of Holland, nor the activity of France, nor the dexterous and firm sagacity of England enterprise ever carried this most perilous mode of hardy industry to the extent to which it has been pushed by this recent people. A people who are still, as it were, but in the gristle, and not yet hardened into the bone of manhood. When I contemplate these things, when I know that the colonies in general owe little or nothing to any care of ours, and that they are not squeezed into this happy form by the constraints of watchful and suspicious government, but that, through a wise and salutary neglect, a generous nature has been suffered to take her own way to perfection. When I reflect upon these effects, when I see how profitable they have been to us, I feel all the pride of power sink, and all the presumption and the wisdom of human contrivances melt and die away within me. My rigor relents. I pardon something to the spirit of liberty. I am sensible, sir, that all which I have asserted in my detail is admitted in the gross, but that quite a different conclusion is drawn from it. America, gentlemen say, is a noble object. It is an object well worth fighting for. Certainly it is, if fighting a people be the best way of gaining them. Gentlemen in this respect will be led to their choice of means by their complexions and their habits. Those who understand the military art will of course have some predilection for it. Those who wield the thunder of the state may have more confidence in the efficacy of arms. But I confess, possibly for want of this knowledge, my opinion is much more in favor of prudent management than of force. Considering force not as odious, but as a feeble instrument for preserving a people so numerous, so active, so growing, so spirited as this, and a profitable and subordinate connection with us. First, sir, permit me to observe that the use of force alone is but temporary. It may subdue for a moment, but it does not remove the necessity of subduing it again. And a nation is not governed which is perpetually to be conquered. My next objection is its uncertainty. Terror is not always the effect of force, and an armament is not a victory. If you do not succeed, you are without resource, for, conciliation failing, force remains, but force failing, no further hope of reconciliation is left. Power and authority are sometimes bought by kindness, but they can never be begged as alms by an impoverished and defeated violence. A further objection to force is that you impair the object by your very endeavors to preserve it. The thing you fought for is not the thing which you recover, but depreciated, sunk, wasted, and consumed in the contest. Nothing less will content me than whole America. I do not choose to consume its strength along with our own, because in all parts it is the British strength that I consume. I do not choose to be caught by a foreign enemy at the end of this exhausting conflict, and still less in the midst of it. I may escape, but I can make no insurance against such an event. Let me add, that I do not choose wholly to break the American spirit, because it is the spirit that has made the country. Lastly, we have no sort of experience in favor of force as an instrument in the rule of our colonies. Their growth and their utility has been owing to methods altogether different. Our ancient indulgence has been said to be pursued to a fault. It may be so, but we know if feeling is evidence that our fault was far more tolerable than our attempt to mend it, and our sin far more salutary than our penitence. These, sir, are my reasons for not entertaining that high opinion of untried force by which many gentlemen, for whose sentiments in other particulars I have great respect, seem to be so greatly captivated. But there's still behind a third consideration concerning this object which serves to determine my opinion on the sort of policy which ought to be pursued in the management of America, even more than its population and its commerce, I mean its temper and character. And this character of the Americans, a love of freedom, is the predominating feature which marks and distinguishes the whole, and, as an ardent, is always a jealous affection. Your colonies become suspicious, restive, and untractable whenever they see the least attempt to wrest from them by force or shuffle from them by chicane what they think the only advantage worth living for. This fierce spirit of liberty is stronger in the English colonies probably than in any other people of the earth, and this from a great variety of powerful causes, which, to understand the true temper of their minds and the direction which this spirit takes, it will not be amiss to lay open somewhat more largely. First, the people of the colonies are descendants of Englishmen. England, sir, is a nation which still, I hope, respects and formerly adored her freedom. The colonists emigrated from you when this part of your character was most predominant, and they took this bias and direction the moment they parted from your hands. They are therefore not only devoted to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. Abstract liberty, like other mere abstractions, is not to be found. Liberty inheres in some sensible object, and every nation has formed to itself some favorite point which by way of eminence becomes the criterion of their happiness. It happened, you know, sir, that the great contests for freedom in this country were from the earliest times chiefly upon the question of taxing. Most of the contests in the ancient commonwealth turned primarily on the right of election of magistrates or on the balance among the several orders of the state. The question of money was not with them so immediate, but in England it was otherwise. On this point of taxes, the ablest pens and most eloquent tongues have been exercised. The greatest spirits have acted and suffered. In order to give the fullest satisfaction concerning the importance of this point, it was not only necessary for those who in argument defended the excellence of the English Constitution to insist on this privilege of granting money as a dry point of fact, and to prove that the right had been acknowledged in ancient parchments and blind usages to reside in a certain body called the House of Commons. They went much farther. They attempted to prove, and they succeeded, that in theory it ought to be so. From the particular nature of a House of Commons as an immediate representative of the people, whether the old records had delivered this oracle or not, it took infinite pains to inculcate as a fundamental principle that in all monarchies the people must in effect themselves, immediately, possess the power of granting their own money, or no shadow of liberty can subsist. Colonies draw from you, as with their lifeblood, these ideas and principles. Their love of liberty, as with you, fixed and attached on the specific point of taxing. Liberty might be safe, or might be endangered, in 20 other particulars, without their being much pleased or alarmed. Here they felt its pulse, and as they found that beat, they thought themselves sick or sound. I do not say whether they were right or wrong in applying your general arguments to their own case. It is not easy, indeed, to make a monopoly of theorems and corollaries. The fact is that they did thus apply those general arguments, and your mode of governing them, whether through lenity or indolence, through wisdom or mistake, confirmed them in the imagination that they, as well as you, had interest in those common principles. They are further confirmed in this pleasing error by the form of their provincial legislative assemblies. Their governments are popular in a high degree. Some are merely popular. In all, the popular representative is the most weighty, and this share of the people in their ordinary government never fails to inspire them with lofty sentiments, with a strong aversion from whatever tends to deprive them of their chief importance. If anything were wanting to this necessary operation of the form of government, religion would have given it a complete effect. Religion, always a principle of energy, in this new people is no way worn out or impaired, and their mode of professing it is also one main cause of this free spirit. The people are Protestants, of that kind which is the most adverse to all implicit submission of mind and opinion. This is the persuasion not only favorable to liberty, but built upon it. I do not think, sir, that the reason of this averseness in the dissenting churches, for all that looks like absolute government, is so much to be sought in their religious tenets as in their history. Everyone knows that the Roman Catholic religion is at least coeval with most governments where it prevails, and that it has generally gone hand in hand with them, and received great favor and every kind of support from authority. The Church of England, too, was formed from her cradle under the nursing care of regular government. But the dissenting interests have sprung up in a direct opposition to all the ordinary powers of the world, and could justify that opposition only on a strong claim to natural liberty. Their very existence depended on the powerful and unremitted assertion of that claim. All Protestantism, even the most cold and passive, is a sort of dissent. But the religion most prevalent in our northern colonies is a refinement on the principle of resistance. It is the dissidence of dissent and the Protestantism of the Protestant religion. This religion, under a variety of denominations agreeing in nothing but in the communion of the spirit of liberty, is predominant in most of the northern provinces, where the Church of England, notwithstanding its legal rights, is in reality no more than a sort of private sect, not composing most probably the tenth of the people. The colonists left England when the spirit was high, and in the emigrants was the highest of all. And even that stream of foreigners which has been constantly flowing to these colonies has, for the greatest part, been composed of dissenters from the establishments of their several countries, who have brought with them a temper and character far from alien to that of the people with whom they mixed. Sir, I can perceive by their manner that some gentlemen object to the latitude of this description, because in the southern colonies the Church of England forms a large body and has a regular establishment. It is certainly true. There is, however, a circumstance attending these colonies which, in my opinion, fully counterbalances this difference, and makes the spirit of liberty still more high and haughty than in those to the northward. It is that in Virginia and the Carolinas they have a vast multitude of slaves. Where this is the case in any part of the world, those who are free are by far the most proud and jealous of their freedom. Freedom is to them not only an enjoyment, but a kind of rank and privilege. Not seeing there that freedom, as in countries where it is a common blessing and as broad and general as they are, may be united with much abject toil, with great misery, with all the exterior of servitude, liberty looks amongst them like something that is more noble and liberal. I do not mean, sir, to commend the superior morality of this sentiment, which has at least as much pride as virtue in it, but I cannot alter the nature of man. The fact is so, and these people of the southern colonies are much more strongly and with a higher and more stubborn spirit attached to liberty than those to the northward. Such were all the ancient commonwealths, such were our Gothic ancestors, such in our days were the Poles, and such will be all masters of slaves who are not slaves themselves. In such a people, the haughtiness of domination combines with the spirit of freedom, fortifies it, and renders it invincible. Permit me, sir, to add another circumstance in our colonies which contributes no mean part towards the growth and effect of this untractable spirit. I mean their education. In no country, perhaps in the world, is the law so general as study. The profession itself is numerous and powerful, and in most provinces it takes the lead. The greater number of the deputies sent to the Congress were lawyers. But all who read, and most do read, endeavor to gain some smattering in that science. I have been told by an eminent bookseller that no branch of his business, after tracts of popular devotion, or so many books as those on the law exported to the plantations. The colonists have now fallen into the way of printing them for their own use. I hear that they sold nearly as many of Blackstone's commentaries in America as in England. General Gage marks out this disposition very particularly in a letter on your table. He states that all the people in his government are lawyers or smatterers in law, and that in Boston they have been enabled, by successful chicane, wholly to evade many parts of one of your capital penal constitutions. The smartness of debate will say that this knowledge ought to teach them more clearly the rights of legislature, their obligations to obedience, and the penalties of rebellion. All this is mighty well, but my honorable and learned friend on the floor, who condescends to mark what I say for omitted version, will disdain that ground. He has heard, as well as I, that when great honors and great emoluments do not win over this knowledge to the service of the state, it is a formidable adversary to government. If the spirit be not tamed and broken by these happy methods, it is stubborn and litigious. Abunt studia in mors. The study renders men acute, inquisitive, dexterous, prompt in attack, ready in defense, full of resources. In other countries, the people more simple and of a less mercurial cast judge of an ill principle in government only by an actual grievance. Here, they anticipate the evil and judge of the pressure of the grievance by the badness of the principle. They augur misgovernment at a distance, and snuff the approach of tyranny in every tainted breeze. The last cause of this disobedient spirit in the colonies is hardly less powerful than the rest, as it is not merely moral, but laid deep in the natural constitution of things. 3,000 miles of ocean lie between you and them. No contrivance can prevent the effect of this distance in weakening government. Seas roll, and months pass, between the order and the execution, and the want of a speedy explanation of a single point is enough to defeat a whole system. You have indeed winged ministers of vengeance, who carry your bolts and their pounces to the remotest verge of the sea. But there, a power steps in that limits the arrogance of raging passions and furious elements, and says, "So far shalt thou go, and no farther." Who are you that you should fret and rage and bite the chains of nature? Nothing worse happens to you than does to all nations who have extensive empire, and it happens in all the forms into which empire can be thrown. In large bodies, the circulation of power must be less vigorous at the extremities. Nature has said it. The Turk cannot govern Egypt and Arabia and Kurdistan as he governs Thrace, nor has he the same dominion in Crimea and Algiers which he has at Brusa and Smyrna. Despotism itself is obliged to truck and huckster. The Sultan gets such obedience as he can. He governs with a loose rein that he may govern at all. And the whole of the force and vigor of his authority in his center is derived from a prudent relaxation in all his borders. Spain, in her provinces, is perhaps not so well obeyed as you are in yours. She complies too. She submits. She watches times. This is the immutable condition, the eternal law of extensive and detached empire. Then, sir, from these 6 capital sources of descent, of form of government, of religion in the northern provinces, of manners in the southern, of education, of the remoteness of situation from the first mover of government, for all these causes, a fierce spirit of liberty has grown up. It has grown with the growth of the people in your colonies, and increased with the increase of their wealth. A spirit that, unhappily meeting with an exercise of power in England which, however lawful, is not reconcilable to any ideas of liberty, much less with theirs, has kindled this flame that is ready to consume us. I do not mean to commend either the spirit in the success or the moral causes which produce it. Perhaps a more smooth and accommodating spirit of freedom in them would be more acceptable to us. Perhaps ideas of liberty might be desired more reconcilable with an arbitrary and boundless authority. Perhaps we might wish the colonists to be persuaded that their liberty is more secure when held in trust for them by us, as their guardians during a perpetual minority, than with any part of it in their own hands. The question is, not whether their spirit deserves praise or blame, but what, in the name of God, shall we do with it? You have before you the object, such as it is, with all its glories, with all its imperfections, on its head. You see the magnitude, the importance, the temper, the habits, the disorders. With all these considerations, we are strongly urged to determine something concerning it. We are called upon to fix some rule and line for our future conduct which may give a little stability to our politics, and prevent the return of such unhappy deliberations as the present. Every such return will bring the matter before us in a still more untractable form. For what astonishing and incredible things have we not seen already? What monsters have not been generated from this unnatural contention? Whilst every principle of authority and resistance has been pushed upon both sides as far as it would go, there is nothing so solid and certain, either in reasoning or in practice, that has not been shaken. Until very lately, all authority in America seemed to be nothing but an emanation from yours. Even the popular part of the colony constitution derived all its activity and its first vital movement from the pleasure of the crown. We thought, sir, that the utmost which the discontented colonies could do was to disturb authority. We never dreamt that they could of themselves supply it, knowing in general what an operose business it is to establish a government absolutely new. But having for our purposes in this contention resolved that none but an obedient assembly should sit, the humors of the people there, finding all passage through the legal channels stopped, with great violence broke out another way. Some provinces have tried their experiment, as we have tried ours, and theirs has succeeded. They have formed a government sufficient for its purposes, without the bustle of a revolution or the formality of an election. Evident necessity and tacit consent have done the business in an instant. So well they have done it that Lord Dunmore, the account is among the fragments on your table, tells you that the new institution is infinitely better obeyed than the ancient government ever was in its most fortunate periods. Obedience is what makes government, and not the names by which it is called, not the name of governor, as formerly, or committee, as at present. This new government has originated directly from the people, and was not transmitted through any of the ordinary artificial media of a positive constitution. It was not a manufacture ready formed and transmitted to them in that condition from England. The evil arising from hence is this, that the colonists, having once found the possibility of enjoying the advantages of order in the midst of a struggle for liberty, such struggles will not henceforward seem so terrible to the settled and sober part of mankind as they had appeared before the trial. Pursuing the same plan of punishing by the denial of the exercise of government to still greater lengths, we wholly abrogated the ancient government of Massachusetts. We were confident that the first feeling, if not the very prospect of anarchy, would instantly enforce a complete submission. The experiment was tried. A new, strange, unexpected face of things appeared. Anarchy is found tolerable. A vast province has now subsisted, and subsisted in a considerable degree of health and vigor for near a 12-month, without governor, without public council, without judges, without executive magistrates. How long it will continue in this state, or what may arise out of this unheard-of situation, how can the wisest of us conjecture? Our late experience has taught us that many of those fundamental principles, formerly believed infallible, are either not of the importance they were imagined to be, or that we have not at all adverted to some other far more important and far more powerful principles, which entirely overrule those we considered as omnipotent. I am much against any further experiments which tend to put to the proof any more of these allowed opinions which contribute so much to the public tranquillity. In effect, we suffer as much at home by this loosening of old ties and this concussion of all established opinions as we do abroad. For in order to prove that the Americans have no right to their liberties, we are every day endeavoring to subvert the maxims which preserve the whole spirit of our own. To prove that the Americans ought not to be free, we are obliged to depreciate the value of freedom itself. And we never to gain a paltry advantage over them in debate with attacking some of those principles or deriding some of those feelings for which our ancestors have shed their blood. But, sir, in wishing to put an end to pernicious experiments, I do not mean to preclude the fullest inquiry. Far from it. Far from deciding on a sudden or partial view, I would patiently go round and round the subject and survey it minutely in every possible aspect. Sir, if I were capable of engaging you to an equal attention, I would state that, as far as I am capable of discerning, there are but three ways of proceeding relative to the stubborn spirit which prevails in your colonies and disturbs your government. These are, to change that spirit as inconvenient by removing the causes, to prosecute it as criminal, or to comply with it as necessary. I would not be guilty of an imperfect enumeration. I can think of but these three. Another has indeed been started, that of giving up the colonies. but it met so slight a reception that I do not think myself obliged to dwell a great while upon it. It is nothing but a little sally of anger, like the forwardness of peevish children who, when they cannot get all that they would have, are resolved to take nothing. The first of these plans, to change the spirit as inconvenient by removing the causes, I think is the most like a systematic proceeding. It is radical in its principle, but it is attended with great difficulties, some of them little short, as I conceive, of impossibilities. This will appear by examining into the plans which have been proposed. As the growing population in the colonies is evidently one cause of their resistance, it was last session mentioned in both houses by men of weight and received not without applause. In order to check this evil, it would be proper for the Crown to make no further grants of land. But to this scheme there are two objections. The first, that there is already so much unsettled land in private hands as to afford room for an immense future population, although the Crown not only withheld its grants, but annihilated its soil. If this be the case, then the only effect of this avarice of desolation, this hoarding of a royal wilderness, would be to raise the value of the possessions in the hands of the great private monopolists, without any adequate check to the growing and alarming mischief of population. But if you stopped your grants, what would be the consequence? The people would occupy without grants. They have already so occupied in many places. You cannot station garrisons in every part of these deserts. If you drive the people from one place, they will carry on their annual tillage and remove with their flocks and herds to another. Many of the people in the back settlements are already little attached to particular situations. Already they have topped the Appalachian Mountains. From thence they behold before them an immense plain, one vast, rich, level meadow, a square of 500 miles. Over this they would wander without a possibility of restraint. They would change their manners with the habits of their life, would soon forget a government by which they were disowned, would become hordes of English Tartars, and, pouring down upon your unfortified frontiers a fierce and irresistible cavalry, become masters of your governors and your councillors, your collectors and comptrollers, and of all the slaves that adhere to them. Such would, and in no long time must be, the effect of attempting to forbid as a crime and to suppress as an evil the command and blessing of Providence, increase and multiply. Such would be the happy result of the endeavor to keep as a lair of wild beasts that earth which God, by an express charter, has given to the children of men. Far different, and surely much wiser, has been our policy hitherto. Hitherto we have invited our people by every kind of bounty to fixed establishments. We have invited the husbandman to look to authority for his title. We have taught him piously to believe in the mysterious virtue of wax and parchment. We have thrown each tract of land as it was peopled into districts, that the ruling power should never be wholly out of sight. We have settled all we could, and we have carefully attended every settlement with government. Adhering, sir, as I do to this policy, as well for the reasons that I have just given, I think this new project of hedging the population to be neither prudent nor practicable. To impoverish the colonies in general, and in particular to arrest the noble course of their marine enterprises, would be a more easy task. I freely confess it. We have shown a disposition to a system of this kind, a disposition even to continue the restraint after the offense, looking on ourselves as rivals to our colonies, and persuaded that of course we must gain or that they shall lose. Much mischief we may certainly do. The power inadequate to all other things is often more than sufficient for this. I do not look on the direct and immediate power of the colonies to resist our violence as very formidable. In this, however, I may be mistaken. But when I consider that we have colonies for no purpose but to be serviceable to us, it seems to my poor understanding a little preposterous to make them unserviceable in order to keep them obedient. It is, in truth, nothing more than the old, and as I thought, exploded problem of tyranny, which proposes to beggar its subjects into submission. But remember, when you have completed your system of impoverishment, that nature still proceeds in her ordinary course, that discontent will increase with misery, and that there are critical moments in the fortune of all states when they who are too weak to contribute to your prosperity may be strong enough to complete your ruin. Spoliatis arma supersunt. The temper and character which prevail in our colonies are, I am afraid, unalterable by any human art. We cannot, I fear, falsify the pedigree of this fierce people and persuade them that they are not sprung from a nation whose veins the blood of freedom circulates. The language in which they would hear you tell them this tale would detect the imposition. Their speech would betray you. An Englishman is the unfittest person on earth to argue another Englishman into slavery. I think it nearly as little in our power to change their republican religion as their free descent, or to substitute the Roman Catholic as a penalty for the Church of England as an improvement. The mode of inquisition and dragooning is going out of fashion in the old world. I should not confine much to their efficacy in the new. The education of the Americans is also on the same unalterable bottom with their religion. You cannot persuade them to burn their books of curious science, to banish their lawyers from their courts of law, or to quench the lights of their assemblies by refusing to choose those persons who are best read in their privileges. It would be no less impracticable to think of wholly annihilating the popular assemblies in which these lawyers sit. The army, by which we must govern in their place, would be far more chargeable to us, not quite as effectual, and perhaps in the end full as difficult to be kept in obedience. With regard to the high, aristocratic spirit of Virginia and the southern colonies, it has been proposed, I know, to reduce it by declaring a general enfranchisement of their slaves. This object has had its advocates and panegyrists, yet I never could argue myself into any opinion of it. Slaves are often much attached to their masters. A general wild offer of liberty would not always be accepted. History furnishes few instances of it. It is sometimes as hard to persuade slaves to be free as it is to compel free men to be slaves. In a suspicious scheme, we would have both these pleasing tasks in our hands at once. But when we talk of enfranchisement, do we not perceive that the American master may enfranchise too, and arm servile hands in defense of freedom? A measure to which other people have had recourse more than once, and not without success, in a desperate situation of their affairs. Slaves, as these unfortunate black people are, and dull as all men are from slavery, must they not a little suspect the offer of freedom from that very nation which had sold them to their present masters? From that nation, one of whose causes of quarrel with those masters is their refusal to deal any more in that inhuman traffic? An offer of freedom from England would come rather oddly, shipped to them in an African vessel, which was refused an entry into the ports of Virginia or Carolina with a cargo of 300 Angola Negroes. It would be curious to see the Guinea captain attempting at the same instant to publish his proclamation of liberty and to advertise his sale of slaves. But let us suppose all these moral difficulties got over. The ocean remains. You cannot pump this dry, and as long as it continues in its present bed, so long all the causes which weaken authority by distance will continue. Ye gods, annihilate but space and time, and make two lovers happy, was a pious and passionate prayer, but just as reasonable as many of the serious wishes of grave and solemn politicians. If then, sir, it seems almost desperate to think of any alternative course for changing the moral causes, and not quite easy to remove the natural, which produce prejudices irreconcilable to the late exercise of our authority, but that the spirit infallibly will continue, and continuing will produce such effects as now embarrass us. The second mode under consideration is to prosecute that spirit and its overt acts as criminal. At this proposition I must pause a moment. The thing seems a great deal too big for my ideas of jurisprudence. It should seem to my way of conceiving such matters that there is a very wide difference in reason and policy between the mode of proceeding on the irregular conduct of scattered individuals, or even of bands of men who disturb order within the state, and the civil dissensions which may, from time to time on great questions, agitate the several communities which compose a great empire. It looks to me to be narrow and pedantic to apply the ordinary ideas of criminal justice to this great public contest. I do not know the method of drawing up an indictment against a whole people. I cannot insult and ridicule the feelings of millions of my fellow creatures, as Sir Edward Coke insulted one excellent individual at the bar. I hope I am not ripe to pass sentence on the gravest public bodies, entrusted with magistracies of great authority and dignity, and charged with the safety of their fellow citizens upon the very same title that I am. I really think that, for wise men, this is not judicious, for sober men not decent, for minds tinctured with humanity not mild and merciful. Perhaps, sir, I am mistaken in my idea of an empire, as distinguished from a single state or kingdom. But my idea of it is this: that an empire is the aggregate of many states under one common head, whether this head be a monarch or a presiding republic. It does, in such constitutions, frequently happen, and nothing but the dismal, cold, dead uniformity of servitude can prevent its happening, for the subordinate parts have many local privileges and immunities. Between these privileges and the supreme common authority, the line may be extremely nice. Of course, disputes, often too, very bitter disputes, and much ill blood will arise. But though every privilege is an exemption in the case from the ordinary exercise of the supreme authority, it is no denial of it. The claim of a privilege seems rather, ex vi termini, to imply a superior power, for to talk of the privileges of a state or of a person who has no superior is hardly any better than speaking nonsense. Now, in such unfortunate quarrels among the component parts of a great political union of communities, I can scarcely conceive anything more completely imprudent than for the head of the empire to insist that, if any privilege is pleaded against his will or his acts, his whole authority is denied. Instantly to proclaim rebellion, to beat to arms, and to put the offending provinces under the ban. Will not this, sir, very soon teach the provinces to make no distinctions on their part? Will not teach them that the government against which a claim of liberty is tantamount to high treason is a government to which submission is equivalent to slavery? It may not always be quite convenient to impress dependent communities with such an idea. We are, indeed, in all disputes with the colonies, by the necessity of things, the judge. It is true, sir, but I confess that the character of judge in my own cause is a thing that frightens me. Instead of filling me with pride, I am exceedingly humbled by it. I cannot proceed with a stern, assured, judicial confidence until I find myself in something more like a judicial character. I must have these hesitations as long as I am compelled to recollect that, in my little reading upon such contests as these, the sense of mankind has at least as often decided against the superior as the subordinate power. Sir, let me add, too, that the opinion of my having some abstract right in my favor would not put me much at my ease in passing sentence, unless I could be sure that there were no rights which, in their exercise under certain circumstances, were not the most odious of all wrongs and the most vexatious of all injustice. Sir, these considerations have great weight with me when I find things so circumstanced, that I see the same party at once a civil litigant against me in point of right and a culprit before me, while I sit as a criminal judge on acts of his whose moral quality is to be decided upon the merits of that very litigation. Men are every now and then put, by the complexity of human affairs, into strange situations, but justice is the same, let the judge be in what situation he will. There is, sir, also a circumstance which convinces me that this mode of criminal proceedings is not, at least in the present stage of our contest, altogether expedient, which is nothing less than the conduct of those very persons who have seemed to adopt the mode by lately declaring a rebellion in Massachusetts Bay, as they had formerly addressed as traitors brought hither under an act of Henry VIII for trial. For though rebellion is declared, it is not proceeded against as such, nor have any steps been taken towards the apprehension or conviction of any individual offender, either on our late or our former address. But modes of public coercion have been adopted, and such as have much more resemblance to a sort of qualified hostility towards an independent power than the punishment of rebellious subjects. All this seems rather inconsistent, but it shows how difficult it is to apply these juridical ideas to our present case. In this situation, let us seriously and coolly ponder. What is it we have got by all our menaces, which have been many and ferocious? What advantage have we derived from the penal laws we have passed, and which for the time have been severe and numerous? What advances have we made towards our object by the sending of a force which, by land and sea, is no contemptible strength? Has the disorder abated? Nothing less. When I see things in this situation, after such confident hopes, bold promises, and active exertions, I cannot for my life avoid a suspicion that the plan itself is not correctly right. If we adopt this mode, if we mean to conciliate and concede, let us see what nature the concession ought to be. To ascertain the nature of our concession, we must look at their complaint. The colonies complain that they have not the characteristic mark and seal of British freedom. They complain that they are taxed in a parliament in which they are not represented. If you mean to satisfy them at all, then you must satisfy them with regard to this complaint. If you mean to please any people, you must give them the boon which they ask, not what you may think better for them, but of a kind totally different. Such an act may be a wise regulation, but is no concession, whereas our present theme is the mode of giving satisfaction. Sir, I think you must perceive that I am resolved this day to have nothing at all to do with the question of the right of taxation. Some gentlemen startle, but it is true. I put it totally out of the question. It is less than nothing in my consideration. I do not indeed wonder, nor will you, sir, that gentlemen of profound learning are fond of displaying it on this profound subject. But my consideration is narrow, confined, and wholly limited to the policy of the question. I do not examine whether the giving away a man's money be a power accepted and reserved out of the general trust of government, and how far all mankind and all forms of polity are entitled to an exercise of that right by the charter of nature, or whether, on the contrary, a right of taxation is necessarily involved in the general principle of legislation, and inseparable from the ordinary supreme power. These are deep questions. Where great names militate against each other, where reason is perplexed, and appeal to authorities only thickens the confusion, where high and revered authorities lift up their heads on both sides, and there is no sure footing in the middle. This point is the great Serbonian bog, betwixt Demeta and Mount Cassius Old, where armies whole have sunk. I do not intend to be overwhelmed in that bog, though in such respectable company. The question with me is, not whether you have a right to render your people miserable, but whether it is not your interest to make them happy. It is not what a lord tells me I may do, but what humanity, reason, and justice tell me I ought to do. Is it a politic act, the worse for being a generous one? Is no concession proper but that which is made from your want of right to keep what you grant? Or does it lessen the grace of dignity of relaxing the exercise of an odious claim because you have your evidence room full of titles and your magazine stuffed with arms to enforce them? What signify all those titles and all those arms? Of what avail are they when the reason of the thing tells me that the assertion of my title is the loss of my suit, and that I could do nothing but wound myself by the use of my own weapons? Such is steadfastly my opinion of the absolute necessity of keeping up the concord of this empire by a unity of spirit, though in a diversity of operations, that, if I were sure the colonists had, their leaving this country, sealed a regular compact of servitude, that they had solemnly abjured all the rights of citizens, that they had made a vow to renounce all ideas of liberty for them and their posterity to all generations. Yet I should hold myself obliged to conform to the temper I found universally prevalent in my own day, and to govern 2 million of men impatient of servitude on the principles of freedom. I am not determining a point of law. I am restoring tranquillity. And the general character and situation of a people must determine what sort of government is fitted for them. That point nothing else can or ought to determine. My idea, therefore, without considering whether we yield as matter of right or grant as matter of favor, is to admit the people of our colonies into an interest in the Constitution, and, by recording that admission in the journals of Parliament, to give them as strong an assurance as the nature of the thing will admit, that we mean forever to adhere to that solemn declaration of systematic indulgence. Some years ago, the repeal of a Revenue Act, upon its understood principle, might have served to show that we intended an unconditional abatement of the exercise of a taxing power. Such a measure was then sufficient to remove all suspicion and to give perfect content. But unfortunate events since that time may make something further necessary, and not more necessary for the satisfaction of the colonies than for the dignity and consistency of our own future proceedings. I have taken a very incorrect measure of the disposition of the House if this proposal in itself would be received with dislike. I think, sir, we have few American financiers. But our misfortune is we are too acute, we are too exquisite in our conjectures of the future, for men oppressed with such great and present evils. The more moderate among the opposers of parliamentary concession freely confess that they hope no good from taxation, but they apprehend the colonists have further views, and if this point were conceded, they would instantly attack the trade laws. These gentlemen are convinced that this was the intention from the beginning, and the quarrel of the Americans with taxation was no more than a cloak and cover to this design. Such has been the language even of a gentleman of real moderation, and of a natural temper well adjusted to fair and equal government. I am, however, sir, not a little surprised at this kind of discourse whenever I hear it, and I am the more surprised on account of the arguments which I constantly find in company with it, which are often urged from the same mouths and on the same day. For instance, when we allege that it is against reason to tax a people under so many restraints in trade as the Americans, the noble lord in the blue ribbon to tell you that the restraints on trade are futile and useless, of no advantage to us, and of no burthen to those on whom they are imposed. That the trade to America is not secured by the acts of navigation, but by the natural and irresistible advantage of a commercial preference. Such is the merit of the trade laws in this posture of the debate. But when strong internal circumstances are urged against the taxes, when the scheme is dissected, when experience and the nature of things are brought to prove, and do prove, the utter impossibility of obtaining an effective revenue from the colonies, when these things are pressed, or rather pressed themselves, so as to drive the advocates of colony taxes to a clear admission of the futility of the scheme, then, sir, the sleeping trade laws revive from their trance, and this useless taxation is to be kept sacred, not for its own sake, but as a counterguard and security of the laws of trade. Then, sir, you keep up revenue laws which are mischievous in order to preserve trade laws that are useless. Such is the wisdom of our plan in both its members. They are separately given up as of no value, and yet one is always to be defended for the sake of the other. I cannot agree with the noble lord, nor with the pamphlet from whence he seems to have borrowed these ideas concerning the inutility of the trade laws, for, without idolizing them, I am sure they are still, in many ways, of great use to us, and in former times they have been of the greatest. They do confine, and they do greatly narrow, the market for the Americans. But my perfect conviction of this does not help me in the least to discern how the revenue laws form any security whatsoever to the commercial regulations, or that these commercial regulations are the true ground of the quarrel, or that the giving way in any one instance of authority is to lose all that may remain unconceded. One fact is clear and indisputable. The public and avowed origin of this quarrel was on taxation. This quarrel has indeed brought on new disputes on new questions, but certainly the least bitter and the fewest of all on the trade laws. To judge which of the two be the real radical cause of quarrel, we have to see whether the commercial dispute did, in order of time, precede the dispute on taxation. There is not a shadow of evidence for it. Next, to enable us to judge whether at this moment a dislike to the trade laws be the real cause of quarrel, it is absolutely necessary to put the taxes out of the question by a repeal. See how the Americans act in this position, and then you will be able to discern correctly what is the true object of controversy, or whether any controversy at all will remain. Unless you consent to remove this cause of difference, it is impossible with decency to assert that the dispute is not upon what it is avowed to be. And I would, sir, recommend to your serious consideration whether it be prudent to form a rule for punishing people, not on their own acts, but on your conjectures. Surely it is preposterous at the very best. It is not justifying your anger by their misconduct, but it is converting your ill will into their delinquency. But the colonies will go further. Alas, alas, when will this speculation against fact and reason end? What will quiet these panic fears which we entertain of the hostile effect of a conciliatory conduct? Is it true that no case can exist in which it is proper for the sovereign to accede to the desires of his discontented subjects? Is there anything peculiar in this case to make a rule for itself? Is all authority, of course, lost when it is not pushed to the extreme? Is it a certain maxim that the fewer causes of dissatisfaction are left by government, the more the subject will be inclined to resist and rebel? All these objections being in fact no more than suspicions, conjectures, divinations, formed in defiance of fact and experience. They did not, sir, discourage me from entertaining the idea of a conciliatory concession founded on the principles which I have just stated. End of Part 1.
Part 2 of Speech by Edmund Burke.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org.
Speech given to the House of Commons on the 22nd of March, 1775, by Edmund Burke.
On Conciliation with America, by Edmund Burke, 1775. In forming a plan for this purpose, I endeavored to put myself in that frame of mind which is the most natural and the most reasonable, and which is certainly the most probable means of securing me from all error. I set out with a perfect distrust of my own abilities, a total renunciation of every speculation of my own, with a profound reverence for the wisdom of our ancestors who have left us the inheritance of so happy a constitution and so flourishing an empire, and, what is 1,000 times more valuable, the treasury of the maxims and principles which formed the one and obtained the other. During the reigns of the kings of Spain, of the Austrian family, whenever they were at a loss in the Spanish councils, it was common for their statesmen to say they ought to consult the genius of Philip II. The genius of Philip II might mislead them, and the issue of their affairs showed that they had not chosen the most perfect standard. But, sir, I am sure that I shall not be misled when, in a case of constitutional difficulty, I consult the genius of the English Constitution. Consulting at that oracle, it was with all due humility and piety, I found 4 capital examples in a similar case before me, those of Ireland, Wales, Chester, and Durham. Ireland, before the English conquest, though never governed by a despotic power, had no parliament. How far the English parliament itself was at that time modelled according to the present form is disputed among antiquaries. We have all the reason in the world to be assured that a form of parliament, such as England then enjoyed, she instantly communicated to Ireland, and we are equally sure that almost every successive improvement in constitutional liberty, as fast as it was made here, was transmitted thither. The feudal baronage and the feudal knighthood, the roots of our primitive constitution, were early transplanted into that soil and grew and flourished there. Magna Carta, if it did not give us originally the House of Commons, gave us at least a House of Commons of weight and consequence. While your ancestors did not churlishly sit down alone to the feast of Magna Carta, Ireland was made immediately a partaker. This benefit of English laws and liberties, I confess, was not at first extended to whole Ireland. Mark the consequence. English authority and English liberties had exactly the same boundaries. Your standard could never be advanced an inch before your privileges. Sir John Davis shows beyond a doubt that the refusal of a general communication of these rights was the true cause why Ireland was 500 years in subduing, and after the vain projects of a military government attempted in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, it was soon discovered that nothing could make that country English, in civility and allegiance, but your laws and your forms of legislature. It was not English arms, but the English Constitution that conquered Ireland. From that time, Ireland has ever had a general parliament, as she had before a partial parliament. You changed the people, you altered their religion, but you never touched the form of the vital substance of free government in that kingdom. You deposed kings, you restored them. You altered the succession to theirs, as well as to your own crown. But you never altered the Constitution, the principle of which was respected by usurpation, restored with the restoration of monarchy, and established, I trust, forever by the glorious Revolution. This has made Ireland the great and flourishing kingdom that it is, and, from a disgrace and a burthen intolerable to this nation, has rendered her a principal part of our strength and ornament. This country cannot be said to have ever formerly taxed her. The irregular things done in the confusion of mighty troubles and on the hinge of great revolutions, even if all were done that is said to have been done, form no example. If they have any effect in argument, they make an exception to prove the rule. None of your own liberties could stand a moment if the casual deviations from them at such times were suffered to be used as proofs of their nullity. By the lucrative amount of such casual breaches in the Constitution, judge what the stated and the fixed rule of supply has been in that kingdom. Your Irish pensioners would starve if they had no other fund to live on than taxes granted by English authority. Turn your eyes to those popular grants from whence all your great supplies are come, and learn to respect that only source of public wealth in the British Empire. My next example is Wales. This country is said to be reduced by Henry III. It was said more truly to be so by Edward I. But though then conquered, it was not looked upon as any part of the realm of England. Its old constitution, whatever that might have been, was destroyed, and no good one was substituted in its place. The care of that tract was put into the hands of Lords Marchers, a form of government of a very singular kind, a strange, heterogeneous monster, something between hostility and government. Perhaps as a sort of resemblance, according to the modes of those terms, to that of commander-in-chief at present, to whom all civil power is granted as secondary. The manners of the Welsh nation followed the genius of the government. The people were ferocious, restive, savage, and uncultivated, sometimes composed, never pacified. Wales within itself was in perpetual disorder, and it kept the frontier of England in perpetual alarm. Benefits from it to the state were none. Wales is only known to England by incursion and invasion. Sir, during that state of things, Parliament was not idle. They attempted to subdue the fierce spirit of the Welsh by all sorts of rigorous laws. They prohibited by statute the sending all sorts of arms into Wales, as you prohibit by proclamation, with something more of doubt on the legality, the sending arms to America. They disarmed the Welsh by statute, as you attempted, but still with more question on the legality, to disarm New England by an instruction. They made an act to drag offenders from Wales into England for trial, as you have done, but with more hardship with regard to America. By another act, where one of the parties was an Englishman, they ordained that his trial should always be by English. They made acts to restrain trade, as you do. They prevented the Welsh from the use of fairs and markets, as you do the Americans from fisheries and foreign ports. In short, when the statute book was not quite so much swelled as it is now, you find no less than 15 acts of penal regulation on the subject of Wales. Here we rub our hands, a fine body of precedents for the authority of Parliament and the use of it. I admit it fully, and pray add likewise to these precedents, that all the while Wales rid this kingdom like an incubus, that it was an unprofitable and oppressive burthen, that an Englishman travelling in that country could not go 6 yards from the high road without being murdered. The march of the human mind is slow. Sir, it was not until after 200 years discovered that, by an internal law, Providence had decreed vexation to violence and poverty to rapine. Your ancestors did, however, at length open their eyes to the ill husbandry of injustice. They found that the tyranny of a free people could of all tyrannies the least be endured, and that laws made against a whole nation were not the most effectual methods of securing its obedience. Accordingly, in the 27th year of Henry VIII, the course was entirely altered. With a preamble stating the entire and perfect rights of the Crown of England, it gave to the Welsh all the rights and privileges of English subjects. A political order was established, the military power gave way to the civil, the marches were turned into counties, but that a nation should have a right to English liberties and yet no share at all in the fundamental security of those liberties, the grant of their own property, seemed a thing so incongruous that, 8 years after, that is, in the 35th of that reign, a complete and not ill-proportioned representation by counties and boroughs was bestowed upon Wales by Act of Parliament. From that moment, as by a charm, the tumult subsided. Obedience was restored. Peace, order, and civilization followed in the train of liberty. When the day star of the English Constitution had arisen in their hearts, all was harmony within and without.
Simul alba nautis stella refulsit, defluit saxis agitatus humo, considunt venti, fugiuntque nubes, et minax, quod sic voluere, ponto unda recumbit.
The very same year, the country palatine of Chester received the same relief from its oppressions and the same remedy to its disorders. Before this time, Chester was little less distempered than Wales. The inhabitants, without rights themselves, were the fittest to destroy the rights of others, and from thence Richard II drew the standing army of archers with which for a time he oppressed England. The people of Chester applied to Parliament in a petition penned as I shall read to you. To the King, our sovereign lord, and most honourable wise, shewen unto your excellent majesty the inhabitants of your grace's county palatine of Chester. 1. That where the said county palatine of Chester is and hath always hitherto exempt, excluded, and separated out and from your high court of Parliament to have any knights and burgesses within the said court, by reason whereof the said inhabitants have hitherto sustained manifold disherrisons, losses, and damages, as well in their lands, goods, and bodies, as in the good civil and politic governance and maintenance of the commonwealth of their said county. 2. And forasmuch as the said inhabitants have always hitherto been bound by the acts and statutes made and ordained by your said highness and your most noble progenitors by authority of the said court, as far forth as other countries, cities, and boroughs have been, that have had their knights and burgesses within your said court of Parliament, and yet have had neither knight ni burgess therefore said county palatine. The said inhabitants, for lack thereof, have been oftentimes touched and grieved with acts and statutes made within the said court, as well derogatory unto the most ancient jurisdictions, liberties, and privileges of your said county palatine, as prejudicial unto the commonwealth, quietness, rest, and peace of your grace's most bounden subjects inhabiting within the same. What did Parliament with this audacious address? Reject it as libel? Treat it as an affront to government? Spurn it as a derogation from the rights of legislature? Did they toss it over the table? Did they burn it by the hands of the common hangman? They took the petition of grievance, all rugged as it was, without softening or temperament, unpurged of the original bitterness and indignation of complaint. They made it the very preamble to their act of redress, and consecrated its principle to all ages in the sanctuary of legislation. Here is my third example. It was attended with the success of the two former. Chester, civilized as well as Wales, has demonstrated that freedom, and not servitude, is the cure of anarchy, as religion, and not atheism, is the true remedy for superstition. Sir, this pattern of Chester was followed in the reign of Charles II with regard to the county palatine of Durham, which is my fourth example. This county had long lain out of the pale of free legislation. So scrupulously was the example of Chester followed that the style of the preamble is nearly the same with that of the Chester Act, and, without affecting the abstract extent of the authority of Parliament, it recognizes the equity of not suffering any considerable district in which the British subjects may act as a body to be taxed without their own voice in the grant. Now, if the doctrines of policy contained in these preambles, and the force of these examples in the Acts of Parliament, avail anything, what can be said against applying them with regard to America? Are not the people of America as much Englishmen as the Welsh? The preamble of the Act of Henry VIII says the Welsh speak a language no way resembling that of His Majesty's English subjects. Are the Americans not as numerous? If we may trust the learned and accurate Judge Barrington's account of North Wales, and take as a standard to measure the rest, there is no comparison. The people cannot amount to above 200,000, not a tenth part of the number in the colonies. Is America in rebellion? Wales was hardly ever free from it. Have you attempted to govern America by penal statutes? You made 15 for Wales. But your legislative authority is perfect with regard to America. Was it less perfect in Wales, Chester, and Durham? But America is virtually represented. What? Does an electric force of virtual representation more easily pass over the Atlantic than pervade Wales, which lies in your neighborhood, or than Chester and Durham, surrounded by abundance of representation that is actual and palpable? But, sir, your ancestors thought this sort of virtual representation, however ample, to be totally insufficient for the freedom of the inhabitants of territories that are so near and comparatively so inconsiderable. How then can I think it sufficient for those which are infinitely greater and infinitely more remote? You will now, sir, perhaps imagine that I am on the point of proposing to you a scheme for representation of the colonies in Parliament. Perhaps I might be inclined to entertain some such thought, but a great flood stops me in my course. Opposite natura, I cannot remove the eternal barriers of the creation. The thing, in that mode, I do not know to be possible. As I meddle with no theory, I do not absolutely assert the impracticability of such a representation. But I do not see my way to it, and those who have been more confident have not been more successful. However, the arm of public benevolence is not shortened, and there are often several means to the same end. When nature has disjoined in one way, wisdom may unite in another. When we cannot give the benefit as we would wish, let us not refuse it altogether. If we cannot give the principle, let us find a substitute. But how? Where? What substitute? Fortunately, I am not obliged, for the ways and means of this substitute, to tax my own unproductive invention. I am not even obliged to go to the rich treasury of the fertile framers of imaginary commonwealths, not to the Republic of Plato, not to the Utopia of More, not to the Oceana of Harrington. It is before me, it is at my feet, and the rude swain treads daily on it with his clouted shoon. I only wish you to recognize, for the theory, the ancient constitutional policy of this kingdom with regard to representation, as that policy has been declared in Acts of Parliament, and, as to the practice, to return to that mode which a uniform experience has marked out to you as best, and in which you walked with security, advantage, and honor until the year 1763. My resolutions, therefore, mean to establish the equity and justice of a taxation of America by grant, and not by imposition, to mark the legal competency of the colony assemblies for the support of their government in peace and for public aids in time of a war, to acknowledge that this legal competency has had a dutiful and beneficial exercise, and that experience has shown the benefit of their grants and the futility of parliamentary taxation as a method of supply. These solid truths compose 6 fundamental propositions. There are 3 more resolutions corollary to these. If you admit the first set, you can hardly reject the others. But if you admit the first, I shall be far from solicitous whether you accept or refuse the last. I think these 6 massive pillars will be of strength sufficient to support the temple of British Concord. I have no more doubt than I entertain of my existence that, if you admitted these, you would command an immediate peace, and, with but tolerable future management, a lasting obedience in America. I am not arrogant in this confident assurance. The propositions are all mere matters of fact, and if they are such facts as draw irresistible conclusions even in the stating, this is the power of truth, and not any management of mine. Sir, I shall open the whole plan to you, together with such observations on the motions as may tend to illustrate them where they want explanation. The first is a resolution, that the colonies and plantations of Great Britain in North America, consisting of 14 separate governments and containing 2 millions and upwards of free inhabitants, have not had the liberty and privilege of electing and sending any knights and burgesses or others to represent them in the High Court of Parliament. As a plain matter of fact, necessary to be laid down, and, accepting the description, is laid down in the language of the Constitution. It is taken nearly verbatim from Acts of Parliament. The second is like unto the first, that the said colonies and plantations have been liable to, and bounden by, several subsidies, payments, rates, and taxes, given and granted by Parliament, for the said colonies and plantations have not their knights and burgesses in the said High Court of Parliament of their own election to represent the condition of their country, by lack whereof they have been oftentimes touched and grieved by subsidies given, granted, and assented to in the said court, in a manner prejudicial to the Commonwealth, quietness, rest, and the peace of the subjects inhabiting within the same. Is this description too hot or too cold, too strong or too weak? Does it arrogate too much to the supreme legislature? Does it lean too much to the claims of the people? If it runs into any of these errors, the fault is not mine. It is the language of your own ancient acts of Parliament. Non mus exermo, sed quo principi, Ophelis, rusticus, abnormis sapiens. It is the genuine produce of the ancient, rustic, manly, homebred sense of this country. I did not dare to rub off a particle of the venerable rust that rather adorns and preserves than destroys the metal. It would be a profanation to touch with a tool the stones which construct the sacred altar of peace. I would not violate with modern polish the ingenuous and noble roughness of these truly constitutional materials. Above all things, I was resolved not to be guilty of tampering, the odious vice of restless and unstable minds. I put my foot in the tracks of our forefathers, where I could neither wander nor stumble. Determining to fix articles of peace, I was resolved not to be wise beyond what was written. I was resolved to use nothing else than the form of sound words, to let others abound in their own sense, and carefully to abstain from all expressions of my own. Where the law is said, I say. In all things else I am silent. I have no organ but for her words. This, if it be not ingenuous, I am sure it is safe. There are indeed words expressive of grievance in the second resolution, which those who are resolved always to be in the right will deny to contain matter of fact, as applied to the present case, although Parliament thought them to be true with regard to the counties of Chester and Durham. They will deny that Americans were ever touched and grieved with the taxes. If they consider nothing in taxes but their weight as pecuniary impositions, there may be some pretense for this denial. But men may be sorely touched and deeply grieved in their privileges as well as in their purses. Men may lose little in property by the act which takes away all their freedom. When a man is robbed of a trifle on the highway, it is not the 2 pence loss that it constitutes the capital outrage. This is not confined to privileges. Even ancient indulgences, withdrawn without offence on the part of those who enjoyed such favors, operate as grievances. But were the Americans then not touched and grieved by the taxes, in some measure, merely as taxes? If so, why were they almost all either wholly repealed or exceedingly reduced? Were they not touched and grieved even by the regulating duties of the 6th of George II? Else, why were the duties first reduced to 1/3 in 1764, and afterwards to a third of that third in the year 1766? Were they not touched and grieved by the Stamp Act? I should say they were, until that tax is revived. Were they not touched and grieved by the duties of 1767, which were likewise repealed, and which Lord Hillsborough tells you, for the ministry, were they contrary to the true principle of commerce? Is not the assurance given by that noble person to the colonies of a resolution to lay no more taxes on them an admission that taxes would touch and grieve them? Is not the resolution of the noble lord in the blue ribbon, now standing on your journals, the strongest of all proofs that parliamentary subsidies really touched and grieved them? Else why all these changes, modifications, repeals, assurances, and resolutions? The next proposition is, that, from the distance of the said colonies, and from other circumstances, no method hath hitherto been devised for procuring a representation in Parliament for the said colonies. This is an assertion of a fact. I go no further on the paper, though, in my private judgment, a useful representation is impossible. I am sure it is not desired by them, nor ought it perhaps by us. But I abstain from opinions. The fourth resolution is, that each of the said colonies hath within itself a body, chosen in part or in the whole by the freemen, freeholders, or other free inhabitants thereof, commonly called a General Assembly or a General Court, with powers legally to raise, levy, and assess, according to the several uses of such colonies, duties and taxes towards defraying all sorts of public services. This competence in the colony assemblies is certain. It is proved by the whole tenor of their acts of supply in all the assemblies, in which the constant style of granting is an aid to his majesty, and acts granting to the crown have regularly for near a century passed the public offices without dispute. Those who have been pleased paradoxically to deny this right, holding that none but the British Parliament can grant to the crown, are wished to look to what is done not only in the colonies, but in Ireland, in one uniform unbroken tenor every session. Sir, I am surprised that this doctrine should come from some of the law servants of the Crown. I say that if the Crown could be responsible, His Majesty, but certainly the ministers, and even these law officers themselves, through which hands the acts passed biennially in Ireland, or annually in the colonies, are in a habitual course of committing impeachable offences. Would habitual offenders have been all presidents of the council, all secretaries of state, all first lords of trade, all attorneys, and all solicitors general? However, they are safe, as no one impeaches them, and there is no ground of charge against them except in their own unfounded theories. The fifth resolution is also a resolution of fact, that the said General Assemblies, General Courts, or other bodies legally qualified as aforesaid, have at sundry times freely granted several large subsidies and public aids for His Majesty's service, according to their abilities, and required thereto by letter from one of His Majesty's principal Secretaries of State, and that the right to grant the same, and their cheerfulness and sufficiency in the said grants, have been at sundry times acknowledged by Parliament. To say nothing of their great expenses in the Indian wars, and not to take their exertion for one so high as the supplies in the year 1695, not to go back to their public contributions in the year 1710, I shall begin to travel only where the journals give me light, resolving to deal in nothing but fact, authenticated by parliamentary record, and to build myself wholly on that solid basis. On the 4th of April, 1748, a committee of this House came to the following resolution. Resolved, that is the opinion of this committee, that it is just and reasonable that the several provinces and colonies of Massachusetts Bay, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island be reimbursed the expenses they have been at in taking and securing to the Crown of Great Britain the island of Cape Breton and its dependencies. The expenses were immense for such colonies. They were above £200,000 sterling, money first raised and advanced on their public credit. On the 28th of January, 1756, a message from the King came to us to this effect. His His Majesty, being sensible of the zeal and vigor with which his faithful subjects of certain colonies in North America have exerted themselves in defense of His Majesty's just rights and possessions, recommends it to this House to take the same into their consideration, and to enable His Majesty to give them such assistance as may be a proper reward and encouragement. On the 3rd of February, 1756, the House came to a suitable resolution, expressed in words nearly the same as those of the message, but with further addition, that the money then voted was an encouragement to the colonies to exert themselves with vigor. It will not be necessary to go through all the testimonies which your own records have given to the truth of my resolutions. I will only refer you to the places in the journals. Volume 27, 16th and 19th May, 1757. Volume 28, June 1st, 1758, April 26th and 30th, 1759, March 26th and 31st, and April 28th, 1760, January 9th and 20th, 1761. Volume 29, January 22nd and 26th, 1762, March 14th and 17th, 1763. Sir, here is a repeated acknowledgment of Parliament that the colonies not only gave, but gave to satiety. This nation has formally acknowledged two things. First, that the colonies had gone beyond their abilities, Parliament having thought it necessary to reimburse them. Secondly, that they acted legally and laudably in their grants of money, and their maintenance of troops, since the compensation is expressly given as reward and encouragement. Reward is not bestowed for acts that are unlawful, and encouragement is not held out to things that deserve reprehension. My resolution, therefore, does nothing more than collect into one proposition what is scattered through your journals. I give you nothing but your own, and you cannot refuse in the gross what you have so often acknowledged in detail. The admission of this, which will be so honorable to them and to you, will, indeed, be mortal to all the miserable stories by which the passions of the misguided people have been engaged in an unhappy system. The people heard, indeed, from the beginning of these disputes, one thing continually dinned in their ears, that reason and justice demanded that the Americans, who paid no taxes, should be compelled to contribute. How did that fact of paying nothing stand when the taxing system began? When Mr. Grenville began to form a system of American revenue, he stated in this House that the colonies were then in debt £2,600,000 sterling money, and was of opinion that they would discharge that debt in 4 years. On this date, those untaxed people were actually subject to the payment of taxes to the amount of $650,000 a year. In fact, however, Mr. Grenville was mistaken. The funds given for sinking the debt did not prove quite so ample as both the colonies and he expected. The calculation was too sanguine. The reduction was not completed till some years after, at different times in different colonies. However, the taxes after the war continued too great to bear any addition, with prudence or propriety, and when the burdens imposed in consequence of former requisitions were discharged, our tone became too high to resort again to requisition. No colony since that time ever has had any requisition whatsoever made to it. We see the sense of the Crown and the sense of Parliament on the protective nature of a revenue by grant. And I search the same journals for the produce of the revenue by imposition. Where is it? Let us know the volume and the page. What is the gross? What is the net produce? To what service is it applied? How have you appropriated its surplus? What? Can none of the many skillful index makers that we are now employing find any trace of it? Well, let them and that rest together. But are the journals which say nothing of the revenue as silent on the discontent? Oh no! A child may find it. It is the melancholy burthen and blot of every page. I think, then, I am, from those journals, justified in the sixth and last resolution, which is, that it hath been found by experience that the manner of granting the said supplies and aids by the said Generals' Assemblies have been more agreeable to the said colonies and more beneficial and conducive to the public service than the mode of giving and granting aids in Parliament, to be raised and paid in the said colonies. This makes the whole of the fundamental part of the plan. The conclusion is irresistible. You cannot say that you were driven by any necessity to an exercise of the utmost rights of legislature. You cannot assert that you took on yourself the task of imposing colony taxes from the want of another legal body that is competent to the purpose of supplying the exigencies of the state without wounding the prejudices of the people. Neither is it true that the body so qualified and having that competence had neglected the duty. The question now on all this accumulated matter is, whether you will choose to abide by profitable experience, or a mischievous theory, whether you would choose to build on imagination or fact, whether you prefer enjoyment or hope, satisfaction in your subjects or discontent. If these propositions are accepted, everything which has been made to enforce a contrary system must, I take it for granted, follow along with it. On that ground, I have drawn the following resolution, which, when it comes to be moved, will naturally be divided in a proper manner. That it may be proper to repeal an act made in the 7th year of the reign of His present Majesty, entitled, An Act for granting certain duties in the British colonies and plantations in America, for allowing a drawback of the duties of customs upon the exportation from this kingdom of coffee and cocoa-nuts of the produce of the said colonies or plantations, for discontinuing the drawbacks payable on China earthenware exported to America, and for more effectually preventing the clandestine running of goods in the said colonies and plantations. And that it may be proper to repeal an act made in the 14th year of the reign of His present Majesty, entitled, An Act to discontinue in such manner, and for such time as are therein mentioned, the landing and discharging, lading or shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise at the town and within the harbor of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay in North America. That it may be proper to repeal an act made in the 14th year of the reign of His present Majesty, entitled, An Act for the impartial administration of justice in the cases of persons questioned for any acts done by them in the execution of the law, or for the suppression of riots and tumults, in the province of Massachusetts Bay in New England. That it may be proper to repeal an act made in the 14th year of the reign of His present Majesty, entitled, An Act for the better regulating of the government of the province of Massachusetts Bay in New England, and also that it may be proper to explain and amend an act made in the 35th year of the reign of King Henry VIII, entitled, An Act for the trial of treasons committed out of the King's dominions. I wish, sir, to repeal the Boston Port Bill, because, independently of the dangerous precedent of suspending the rights of the subject during the King's pleasure, it was passed, as I apprehend, with less regularity and on more partial principles than it ought. The corporation of Boston was not heard before it was condemned. Other towns, full as guilty as she was, have not had their ports blocked up. Even the restraining bill of the present session does not go to the length of the Boston Port Act. The same ideas of prudence which induced you not to extend equal punishment to equal guilt, even when you were punishing, induced me, whom we not to chastise but to reconcile, to be satisfied with the punishment already partially inflicted. Ideas of prudence and accommodation to circumstances prevent you from taking away the charters of Connecticut and Rhode Island, as you have taken away that of Massachusetts Bay. Though the Crown has far less power in the two former provinces than it enjoyed in the latter, and though the abuses have been full as great and as flagrant in the exempted as in the punished, the same reasons of prudence and accommodation have weight with me in restoring the charter of Massachusetts Bay. Besides, sir, the act which changes the charter of Massachusetts is in many particulars so exceptionable that if I did not wish absolutely to repeal, I would by all means desire to alter it, as several of its provisions tend to the subversion of all public and private justice. Such, among others, is the power in the governor to change the sheriff at his pleasure, to make a new returning officer for every special cause. It is shameful to behold such a regulation standing among English laws. The act for bringing persons accused of committing murder under the orders of government to England for trial is but temporary. That act has calculated the probable duration of our quarrel with the colonies, and is accommodated to that supposed duration. I would hasten the happy moment of reconciliation, and therefore must, on my principle, get rid of that most justly obnoxious act. The act of Henry VIII, for the trial of treasons, I do not mean to take away, but to confine it to its proper bounds and original intention, to make it expressly for trial of treasons, and the greatest treasons may be committed in places where the jurisdiction of the Crown does not extend. Having guarded the privileges of local legislature, I would next secure to the colonies a fair and unbiased judicature, for which purpose, sir, I propose the following resolution: that, from the time when the General Assembly or General Court of any colony or plantation in North America shall have appointed by Act of Assembly, duly confirmed, a settled salary to the offices of the Chief Justice and other judges of the Superior Court, it may be proper that the said Chief Justice and other judges of the Superior Courts of such colony shall hold his and their office and offices during their good behaviour, and shall not be removed therefrom, but when the said removal shall be adjudged by his Majesty in Council, upon a hearing on complaint from the General Assembly, or on a complaint from the Governor, or Council, or the House of Representatives severally, or of the colony in which the said Chief Justice and other judges have exercised the said offices. The next resolution relates to the Courts of Admiralty. It is this: that it may be proper to regulate the Courts of Admiralty or Vice Admiralty, authorized by the 15th chapter of the 4th of George III, in such a manner as to make the same more commodious to those who sue or are sued in the said courts, and to provide for the more decent maintenance of the judges in the same. These courts I do not wish to take away. They are themselves proper establishments. This court is one of the capital securities of the Act of Navigation. The extent of its jurisdiction, indeed, has been increased, but this is altogether as proper, and is indeed on many accounts more eligible, where new powers were wanted, than a court absolutely new. But courts, incommodiously situated, in effect deny justice, and a court partaking in the fruits of its own condemnation is a robber. A Congress complain, and complain justly, of this grievance. These are the three consequential propositions. I have thought of two or three more, but they come rather too near detail, and to the province of executive government, which Parliament always to superintend, never to assume. If the first six are granted, congruity will carry the latter three. If not, the things that remain unrepealed will be, I hope, rather unseemly encumbrances on the building than very materially detrimental to its strength and stability. Here, sir, I should close, but I plainly perceive some objections remain which I ought, if possible, to remove. The first will be that, in resorting to the doctrine of our ancestors as contained in the preamble to the Chester Act, I prove too much, that the grievance from a want of representation stated in that preamble goes to the whole of legislation as well to taxation, and that the colonies, grounding themselves upon that doctrine, will apply it to all parts of legislative authority. To this objection, with all possible deference and humility, and wishing as little as any man living to impair the smallest particle of our supreme authority, I answer that the words are the words of Parliament and not mine, that all false and inconclusive inferences drawn from them are not mine, for I heartily disclaim any such inference. I have chosen the words of an Act of Parliament which Mr. Grenville, surely a tolerably zealous and very judicious advocate for the sovereignty of Parliament, formerly moved to have read at your table in confirmation of his tenets. It is true that Lord Chatham considered these preambles as declaring strongly in favor of his opinions. He was a no less powerful advocate for the privileges of the Americans. Ought I not from hence to presume that these preambles are as favorable as possible to both, properly understood, favorable both to the rights of Parliament and to the privilege of dependencies of this Crown? But, sir, the object of grievance in my resolution I have not taken from the Chester, but from the Durham Act, which confines the hardship of want of representation to the case of subsidies, and which therefore falls in exactly with the case of the colonies. But whether the unrepresented counties were de jure or de facto bound, the preambles do not accurately distinguish, nor indeed was it necessary. For, whether de jure or de facto, the legislature thought the exercise of the power of taxing as of right or as of fact without right equally a grievance and equally oppressive. I do not know that the colonies have, in any general way, or in any cool hour, gone much beyond the demand of humanity in relation to taxes. It is not fair to judge of the temper or dispositions of any man or any set of men when they are composed and at rest from their conduct or their expressions in a state of disturbance and irritation. It is besides a very great mistake to imagine that mankind follow out practically any speculative principle, either of government or of freedom, as far as it will go in argument and logical relation. We Englishmen stop very short of the principles upon which we support any given part of our Constitution, or even the whole of it together. I could easily, if I have not already tired you, giving you more striking and convincing instances of it. This is nothing but what is natural and proper. All government, indeed every human benefit and enjoyment, every virtue, and every prudent act, is founded on compromise and barter. We balance inconveniences, we give and take, we remit some rights that we may enjoy others, and we choose rather to be happy citizens than subtle disputants. As you must give away some natural liberty to enjoy civil advantages, so you must sacrifice some civil liberties for the advantages to be derived from the communion and fellowship of a great empire. But, in all fair dealings, the thing bought must bear some proportion to the purchase paid. None will barter away the immediate jewel of his soul. Though a great house is apt to make slaves haughty, yet it is purchasing a part of the artificial importance of a great empire, too dear to pay for it all essential rights and all the intrinsic dignity of human nature. None of us would not risk his life rather than fall under a government purely arbitrary. But although there are some amongst us who think our Constitution wants many improvements to make it a complete system of liberty, perhaps none who are of that opinion would think it right to aim at such improvement by disturbing his country and risking everything that is dear to him. In every arduous enterprise, we consider what we are to lose as well as what we are to gain. And the more and better stake of liberty every people possess, the less they will hazard in a vain attempt to make it more. These are the courts of man. Man acts from adequate motives relative to his interest, and not on metaphysical speculations. Aristotle, the great master of reasoning, cautions us, and with great weight and propriety, against a species of delusive geometrical accuracy in moral arguments as the most fallacious of all sophistry. The Americans will have no interest contrary to the grandeur and glory of England when they are not oppressed by the weight of it. And they will rather be inclined to respect the acts of a superintending legislature when they see them the acts of that power which is itself the security, not the rival, of their secondary importance. And this assurance my mind most perfectly acquiesces, and I confess I feel not the least alarm from the discontents which are to arise from putting people at their ease. Nor do I apprehend the destruction of this empire from giving, by an act of free grace and indulgence, to 2 millions of my fellow citizens some share of those rights upon which I have always been taught to value myself. It is said, indeed, that this power of granting, vested in American assemblies, would dissolve the unity of the empire, which was preserved entire, although Wales, and Chester, and Durham were added to it. Truly, Mr. Speaker, I do not know what this unity means, nor has it ever been heard of, that I know, in the constitutional policy of this country. The very idea of subordination of parts excludes this notion of simple and undivided unity. England is the head, but she is not the head in the members too. Ireland has ever had from the beginning a separate, but not an independent legislature, which, far from distracting, promoted the union of the whole. Everything was sweetly and harmoniously disposed through both islands for the conservation of English dominion and the communication of English liberties. I do not see that the same principles might not be carried into 20 islands and with the same good effect. This is my model with regard to America, as far as the internal circumstances of the two countries are the same. I know no other unity of this empire that I can draw from as example during these periods, when it seemed, to my poor understanding, more united than it is now, or than it is likely to be by the present methods. But since I speak of these methods, I recollect, Mr. Speaker, almost too late, that I promised, before I finished, to say something of the proposition of the noble lord on the floor, which has been so lately received and stands in your journals. I must be deeply concerned, whenever it is my misfortune to continue a difference with the majority of this House. But as the reasons for that difference are my apology for thus troubling you, suffer me to state them in a very few words. I shall compress them into as small a body as I possibly can, having already debated that matter at large when the question was before the committee. First, then, I cannot admit that proposition of a ransom by auction, because it is a mere project. It is a thing new, unheard of, supported by no experience, justified by no analogy, without example of our ancestors or root in the Constitution. It is neither regular parliamentary taxation nor colony grant. Experimentum in corpore vili is a good rule, which will ever make me adverse to any trial of experiments on what is certainly the most valuable of all subjects, the peace of this empire. Secondly, it is an experiment which must be fatal in the end to our Constitution. What is it but a scheme for taxing the colonies in the antechamber of the noble lord and his successors? To settle the quotas and proportions in this House is clearly impossible. You, sir, may flatter yourself you shall sit a state auctioneer, with your hammer in your hand, and knock down each colony as it bids. but to settle, on the plan laid down by the noble lord, the true proportional payment for 4 or 25 governments, according to the absolute and the relative wealth of each, and according to the British proportion of wealth and burthen, is a wild and chimerical notion. This new taxation must therefore come in by the back door of the Constitution. Each quota must be brought to this House ready formed. You can neither add nor alter. You must register it. You can do nothing further, for on what grounds can you deliberate either before or after the proposition? You cannot hear the council for all these provinces, quarrelling each on its own quantity of payment in its proportion to others if you should attempt it. The committees of provincial ways and means, or by whatever other name it shall delight to be called, must swallow up all the time of Parliament. Thirdly, it does not give satisfaction to the complaint of the colonies. They complain that they are taxed without their consent. You answer that you will fix the sum at which they shall be taxed. That is, you will give them the very grievance for the remedy. You tell them, indeed, that it will leave the mode to themselves. I really beg pardon. It gives me pain to mention it, but you must be sensible that you will not perform this part of the compact. For, suppose the colonies were to lay the duties, which furnish their contingent, upon the importation of your manufactures. You know you would never suffer such a tax to be laid. You know, too, that you would not suffer many other modes of taxation, so that, when you come to explain yourself, it will be found that you will neither leave to themselves the quantum, nor the mode, nor indeed anything. The whole is delusion from one end to the other. Fourthly, this method of ransom by auction, unless it be universally accepted, will plunge you into great and inextricable difficulties. In what year of our Lord are the proportions of payments to be settled? To say nothing of the impossibility that colony agents should have general powers of taxing the colonies at their discretion. Consider, I implore you, that the communication by special messages and orders between these agents and their constituents, on each variation of the case, when the parties come to contend together to dispute on their relative proportions, will be a matter of delay, perplexity, and confusion that never can have an end. If all the colonies do not appear at the outcry, what is the condition of those assemblies who offer, by themselves or their agents, to tax themselves up pure ideas of their proportion? The refractory colonies who refuse all composition will remain taxed only to your old impositions, which, however grievous in principle, are trifling as to production. The obedient colonies in this scheme are heavily taxed. The refractory remain unburdened. What will you do? Will you lay new and heavier taxes by Parliament on the disobedient? Pray consider in what way you can do it. You are perfectly convinced that, in the way of taxing, you can do nothing but at the ports. I suppose it is Virginia that refuses to appear at your auction, while Maryland and North Carolina bid handsomely for their ransom and are taxed to your quota. How will you put these colonies on a par? Will you tax the tobacco of Virginia? If you do, you give its death wound to your English revenue at home, and one of the very greatest articles of your own foreign trade. If you tax the import of that rebellious colony, what do you tax but your own manufactures, or the goods of some other obedient and already well-taxed colony? Who has said one word on this labyrinth of detail, which bewilders you more and more as you enter into it? Who can present you with a clue to lead you out of it? I think, sir, it is impossible that you should not recollect that the colony bounds are so implicated in one another, you know it by your other experiments in the bill for prohibiting the New England fishery, that you can lay no possible restraints on almost any of them which may not be presently eluded. If you do not confound the innocent with the guilty, and burden those whom, upon every principle, you ought to exonerate. He must be grossly ignorant of America, who thinks that, without falling into this confusion of all rules of equity and policy, you can restrain any single colony, especially Virginia and Maryland, the central and most important of them all. Let it also be considered that, either in the present confusion you settle a permanent contingent, which will and must be trifling, and then you have no effectual revenue, or you change the quota at every exigency, then on every new repetition you will have a new quarrel. Reflect, besides, that when you fixed a quota for every colony, you have not provided for prompt and punctual payment. Suppose 1, 2, 5, 10 years arrears. You cannot issue a treasury extent against the failing colony. You must make new Boston port bills, new restraining laws, new acts for dragging men to England for trial. You must send out new fleets, new armies. All is to begin again. From this day forward, the empire is never to know an hour's tranquillity. An intestine fire will be kept alive in the bowels of the colonies, which one time or other must consume this whole empire. I allow indeed that the Empire of Germany raises her revenue and her troops by quotas and contingents, but the revenue of the Empire and the army of the Empire is the worst revenue and the worst army in the world. Instead of a standing revenue, you will therefore have a perpetual quarrel. Indeed, the noble lord who proposed this project of a ransom by auction seems himself to be of that opinion. His project was rather designed for breaking the union of the colonies than for establishing a revenue. He confessed he apprehended that his proposal would not be to their taste. I say the scheme of disunion seems to be at the bottom of the project, for I will not suspect that the noble lord meant nothing but merely to delude the nation by an airy phantom which he never intended to realize. But whatever his views may be, as he proposed the peace and union of the colonies as the very foundation of my plan, it cannot accord with one whose foundation is perpetual discord. Compare the two. This I offer to give you is plain and simple, the other full of perplexed and intricate mazes. This is mild, that harsh. This is found by experience effectual for its purposes, the other is a new project. This is universal, the other calculated for certain colonies only. This is immediate in its conciliatory operation, the other remote, contingent, full of hazard. Mine is what becomes the dignity of a ruling people, gratuitous, unconditional, and not held out as a matter of bargain and sale. I have done my duty in proposing it to you. I have indeed tired you by a long discourse. But this is the misfortune of those to whose influence nothing will be conceded, and who must win every inch of their ground by argument. You have heard me with goodness. May you decide with wisdom. For my part, I feel my mind greatly disburthened by what I have done today. I have been the less fearful of trying your patience, because on this subject I mean to spare it altogether in future. I have this comfort, that in every stage of the American affairs I have steadily imposed the measures that have produced the confusion and may bring on the destruction of this empire. And I go so far as to risk a proposal of my own. If I cannot give peace to my country, I give it to my conscience. But what, says this financier, is peace to us without money? Your plan gives us no revenue. No, but it does. For it secures to the subject the power of refusal, the first of all revenues. Experience is a cheat and fact a liar. If this power and the subject of proportioning his grant, or of not granting at all, has not been found the richest mine of revenue ever discovered by the skill or by the fortune of man. Does not indeed vote you £152,750 11 pence 23 and 4, nor any other paltry limited sum, but it gives the strong box itself, the fund, the bank from whence only revenues can arise amongst a people sensible of freedom. Posita luditur arca. Cannot you, in England, cannot you, at this time of day, cannot you, a House of Commons, trust to the principle which has raised so mighty a revenue and accumulated a debt of nearly 140 million in this country? Is this principle to be true in England and false everywhere else? Is it not true in Ireland? Has it not hitherto been true in the colonies? Why should you presume that, in any country, a body duly constituted for any function will neglect to perform its duty and abdicate its trust? Such a presumption would go against all governments in all modes. But in truth, this dread of penury of supply from a free assembly has no foundation in nature. For first, observe that, besides the desire which all men have naturally of supporting the honor of their own government, that sense of dignity and that security to property which ever attends freedom has a tendency to increase the stock of the free community. Most may be taken where most is accumulated. And what is the soil or climate where experience has not uniformly proved that the voluntary flow of heaped up plenty, bursting from the weight of its own rich luxuriance, has ever run with a more copious stream of revenue than could be squeezed from the dry husks of impressed indigence by the straining of all the politic machinery in the world? Next, we know that parties must ever exist in a free country. We know, too, that the emulations of such parties, their contradictions, their reciprocal necessities, their hopes, and their fears, must send them all in turns to him that holds the balance of the state. The parties are the gamesters, but government keeps the table, and is sure to be the winner in the end. When this game is played, I really think it is more to be feared that the people will be exhausted than the government will not be supplied. Whereas, whatever is got by acts of absolute power ill obeyed because odious, or by contracts ill kept because constrained, will be narrow, feeble, uncertain, and precarious. These would retract vows made in pain as violent and void. I, for one, protest against compounding our demands. I declare against compounding, for a poor limited sum, the immense, ever-growing, eternal debt which is due to a generous government from protected freedom. And so may I speed in the great object I propose to you, as I think it would not only be an act of injustice, but would be the worst economy in the world, to compel the colonies to a sum certain, either in the way of ransom or in the way of compulsory compact. But to clear up my ideas on this subject, a revenue from America transmitted hither, do not delude yourselves, you can never receive it, no, not a shilling. We've experienced that from remote countries it is not to be expected. If, when you attempted to extract revenue from Bengal, you are obliged to return in loan what you had taken in possession, what can you expect from North America? Or certainly, if ever there was a country qualified to produce wealth, it is India. Or an institution fit for the transmission, it is the East India Company. America has none of these aptitudes. If America gives you taxable objects on which you lay your duties here, and gives you at the same time a surplus by a foreign sale of her commodities to pay the duties on these objects which you tax at home, she has performed her part to the British revenue. But with regard to her own internal establishments, she may, I doubt not she will, contribute in moderation. I say in moderation, for she ought not to be permitted to exhaust herself. She ought to be reserved to a war, the weight of which, with the enemies that we are most likely to have, must be considerable in her quarter of the globe. There she may serve you, and serve you essentially. For that service, for all service, whether of revenue, trade, or empire, my trust is in her interest in the British Constitution. My hold of the colonies is in the close affection which grows from common names, from kindred blood, from similar privileges, and equal protection. These are ties which, though light as air, are as strong as links of iron. Let the colonists always keep the idea of their civil rights associated with your government. They will cling and grapple to you, and no force under heaven will be of power to tear them from their allegiance. But let it be once understood that your government may be one thing and their privileges another, that these two things may exist without any mutual relation, the cement is gone. The cohesion is loosened, and everything hastens to decay and dissolution. As long as you have the wisdom to keep the sovereign authority of this country as the sanctuary of liberty, the sacred temple consecrated to our common faith, wherever the chosen race and sons of England worship freedom, they will turn their faces towards you. The more they multiply, the more friends you will have. The more ardently they love liberty, the more perfect will be their obedience. Slavery they can have anywhere. It is a weed that grows in every soil. They may have it from Spain, they may have it from Prussia. But until you become lost to all feeling of your true interest in your natural dignity, freedom they can have from none but you. This is the commodity of price of which you have the monopoly. This is the true act of navigation which binds to you the commerce of the colonies, and through them secures to you the wealth of the world. Deny them this participation of freedom, and you break that sole bond which originally made, and must still preserve, the unity of the empire. Do not entertain so weak an imagination that your registers and your bonds, your affidavits and your sufferances, your cockets and your clearances, are what form the great securities of your commerce. Do not dream that your letters of office and your instructions and your suspending clauses are the things that hold together the great contexture of the mysterious whole. These things do not make your government. Dead instruments, passive tools as they are, it is the spirit of the English communion which gives all their life and efficacy to them. The spirit of the English Constitution, which, infused through the mighty mass, pervades, feeds, unites, invigorates, vivifies every part of the empire, even down to the minutest member. Is it not the same virtue which does everything for us here in England? Do you imagine, then, that it is the Land Tax Act which raises your revenue? That it is the annual vote in the Committee of Supply which gives you your army? Or that it is the Mutiny Bill which inspires it with bravery and discipline? No, surely no. It is the love of the people. It is their attachment to their government from the sense of the deep stake they have in such a glorious institution, which gives you your army and your navy, and infuses into both that liberal obedience without which your army would be a base rabble, and your navy nothing but rotten timber. All this, I know well enough, will sound wild and chimerical to the profane herd of those vulgar and mechanical politicians who have no place among us, a sort of people who think that nothing exists but what is gross and material. and who, therefore, far from being qualified to be directors of the great movement of empire, are not fit to turn a wheel in the machine. But to men truly initiated and rightly taught, these ruling and master principles which, in the opinion of such men as I have mentioned, have no substantial existence, are in truth everything, and all in all. Magnanimity in politics is not seldom the truest wisdom, and a great empire and little minds go ill together. If we are conscious of our station and glow with zeal to fill our place as becomes our situation and ourselves, we ought to auspicate all our public proceedings on America with the old warning of the Church, Sursum corda. We ought to elevate our minds to the greatness of that trust to which the order of Providence has called us. By adverting to the dignity of this high calling, our ancestors have turned a savage wilderness into a glorious empire. We have made the most extensive and the only honorable conquests, not by destroying, but by promoting the wealth, the number, the happiness of the human race. Let us get an American revenue as we have got an American empire. English privileges have made it all that it is. English privileges alone will make it all it can be. In full confidence of this unalterable truth, I now, quod Felix Faustumcasi, lay the first stone of the temple of peace, and I move you, that the colonies and plantations of Great Britain in North America, consisting of 14 separate governments and containing 2 millions and upwards of free inhabitants, have not had the liberty and privilege of electing and sending any knights and burgesses or others to represent them in the High Court of Parliament. End of speech. This speech read aloud by Aaron Cotton.
Speech by Queen Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Speech given to the House of Commons on February the 1st, 1849. My Lords and Gentlemen, the period being arrived at which the business of Parliament is usually resumed, I have called you together for the discharge of your important duties. It is satisfactory to me to be enabled to state that both in the north and in the south of Europe the contending parties have consented to a suspension of arms for the purpose of negotiating terms of peace. The hostilities carried on in the island of Sicily were attended with circumstances so revolting that the British and French admirals were impelled by motives of humanity to interpose, and to stop the further effusion of blood. I have availed myself of the interval thus obtained to propose, in conjunction with France, to the King of Naples, an arrangement calculated to produce a permanent settlement of affairs in Sicily. The negotiation on these matters is still pending. It has been my anxious endeavor, in offering my good offices to the various contending powers, to prevent the extension of the calamities of war, and to lay the foundations for lasting and honorable peace. It is my constant desire to maintain with all foreign states the most friendly relations. As soon as the interests of the public service will permit, I shall direct the papers connected with these transactions to be laid before you. A rebellion of a formidable character has broken out in the Punjab, and the Governor-General of India has been compelled, for the preservation of the peace of the country, to assemble a considerable force which is now engaged in military operations against the insurgents. But the tranquillity of British India has not been affected by these unprovoked disturbances. I again commend to your attention the restrictions imposed on commerce by the navigation laws. If you shall find that these laws are in whole or in part unnecessary for the maintenance of our maritime power, while they fetter trade and industry, you will no doubt deem it right to repeal or modify their provisions. Gentlemen of the House of Commons, I have directed the estimates for the service of the year to be laid before you. They will be framed with the most anxious attention to a wise economy. The present aspect of affairs has enabled me to make large reductions on the estimates of last year. My Lords and Gentlemen, I observe with satisfaction that this portion of the United Kingdom has remained tranquil amidst the convulsions which have disturbed so many parts of Europe. The insurrection in Ireland has not been renewed, but a spirit of disaffection still exists, and I am compelled, to my great regret, to ask for a continuance, for a limited time, of those powers which in the last session you deemed necessary for the preservation of the public tranquillity. I have great satisfaction in stating that commerce is reviving from those shocks which, at the commencement of last session, I had to deplore. The condition of the manufacturing districts is likewise more encouraging than it has been for a considerable period. It is also gratifying to me to observe that the state of the revenue is one of progressive improvement. I have to lament, however, that another failure in the potato crop has caused very severe distress in some parts of Ireland. The operation of the laws for the relief of the poor in Ireland will properly be a subject of your inquiry, and any measures by which those laws may be beneficially amended, and the condition of the people may be improved, will receive my cordial assent. It is with pride and thankfulness that I advert to the loyal spirit of my people, and that attachment to our institutions which has animated them during a period of commercial difficulty, deficient production of food, and political revolution. I look to the protection of Almighty God for favor in our continued progress, and I trust that you will assist me in upholding the fabric of the Constitution, founded as it is upon the principles of freedom and of justice. End of speech. Recording by Ginger Kukalo.
Speech by Herbert Asquith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniel Vimont. Speech given to the House of Commons on August 6, 1914, by Herbert Asquith. In asking the committee to agree to the resolution which Mr. Whitley has just read from the chair, I do not propose, because I do not think it is in any way necessary, to traverse again the ground which was covered by my right honorable friend, the Foreign Secretary, 2 or 3 nights ago. He stated, and I do not think any of the statements he made are capable of answer, and certainly have not yet been answered, the grounds upon which, with the utmost reluctance and with infinite regret, His Majesty's government have been compelled to put this country in a state of war, with what for many years, and indeed generations past, has been a friendly power. But, sir, the papers, which have since been presented to Parliament, and which are now in the hands of honourable members, will, I think, show how strenuous, how unremitting, how persistent, even when the last glimmer of hope seemed to have faded away, were the efforts of my right honourable friend to secure for Europe an honourable and a lasting peace. Everyone knows, in the great crisis which occurred last year in the east of Europe, it was largely, if not mainly, by the acknowledgment of all Europe, due to the steps taken by my right honourable friend, that the area of the conflict was limited, and that so far as the great powers are concerned, peace was maintained. If his efforts upon this occasion have, unhappily, been less successful, I am certain that this House and the country, and I will add posterity and history, will accord to him what is, after all, the best tribute that can be paid to any statesman, that, never derogating for an instant or by an inch from the honor and interests of his own country, he has striven, as few men have striven, to maintain and preserve the greatest interest of all countries, universal peace. These papers, which are now in the hands of honourable members, show something more than that. They show what were the terms which were offered to us in exchange for our neutrality. I trust that not only the members of this House, but all our fellow subjects everywhere, will read the communications, will read, learn, and mark the communications which passed only a week ago today, between Berlin and London in this matter. The terms by which it was sought to buy our neutrality are contained in the communication made by the German Chancellor to Sir Edward Goschen on the 29th July, number 85 of the published papers. I think I must refer to them for a moment. After alluding to the state of things as between Austria and Russia, Sir Edward Goschen goes on. He, the German Chancellor, then proceeded to make the following strong bid for British neutrality. He said that it was clear, so far as he was able to judge the main principle which governed British policy, that Great Britain would never stand by and allow France to be crushed in any conflict there might be. That, however, was not the object at which Germany aimed. Provided that neutrality of Great Britain were certain, every assurance would be given to the British government that the imperial government, let the committee observe these words, aimed at no territorial acquisition at the expense of France should they prove victorious in any war that might ensue. Sir Edward Goschen proceeded to put a very pertinent question. I questioned His Excellency about the French colonies. What are the French colonies? They mean every part of the dominions and possessions of France outside the geographical area of Europe. And he said that he was unable to give a similar undertaking in that respect. Let me come to what, in my mind, personally, has always been the crucial and almost the governing consideration, namely, the position of the small states. As regards Holland, however, His Excellency said that so long as Germany's adversaries respected the integrity and neutrality of the Netherlands, Germany was ready to give His Majesty's government an assurance that she would do likewise. Then we come to Belgium. It depended upon the action of France what operations Germany might be forced to enter upon in Belgium, but when the war was over, Belgian integrity would be respected if she had not sided against Germany. Let the committee observe the distinction between those two cases. In regard to Holland, it was not only independence and integrity, but also neutrality. But in regard to Belgium, there was no mention of neutrality at all. Nothing but an assurance that after the war came to an end, the integrity of Belgium would be respected. Then His Excellency added, ever since he had been Chancellor, the object of his policy had been to bring about an understanding with England. He trusted that these assurances, the assurances I have read out to the House, might form the basis of that understanding which he so much desired. What does that amount to? Let me just ask the committee. I do so not with the object of inflaming passion, certainly not with the object of exciting feeling against Germany, but I do so to vindicate and make clear the position of the British government in this matter. What did that proposal amount to? In the first place, it meant this, that behind the back of France, they were not made a party to these communications, we should have given, if we had assented to that, a free license to Germany to annex, in the event of a successful war, the whole of the extra-European dominions and possessions of France. What did it mean as regards Belgium? When she addressed, as she has addressed in these last few days, her moving appeal to us to fulfill our solemn guarantee of her neutrality, what reply should we have given? What reply should we have given to that Belgian appeal? We should have been obliged to say that, without her knowledge, we had bartered away to the power threatening her our obligation to keep our plighted word. The House has read, and the country has read, of course, in the last few hours, the most pathetic appeal addressed by the King of Belgium, and I do not envy the man who can read that appeal with an unmoved heart. Belgians are fighting and losing their lives. What would have been the position of Great Britain today, in the face of that spectacle, if we had assented to this infamous proposal? Yes, and what are we to get in return for the betrayal of our friends and the dishonor of our obligations? What are we to get in return? A promise, nothing more, A promise as to what Germany would do in certain eventualities. A promise, be it observed, I am sorry to have to say it, but it must be put upon record, given by a power which was at that very moment announcing its intention to violate its own treaty and inviting us to do the same. I can only say, if we had dallied or temporized, we, as a government, should have covered ourselves with dishonor, and we should have betrayed the interests of this country, of which we are trustees. I am glad, and I think the country will be glad, to turn to the reply which my right honorable friend made, and of which I will read to the committee 2 of the more salient passages. This document, number 101 of the papers, puts on record a week ago the attitude of the British government and, as I believe, of the British people. My right honorable friend says, His Majesty's government cannot for a moment entertain the Chancellor's proposal that they should bind themselves to neutrality on such terms. What he asks us, in effect, is to engage to stand by while French colonies are taken if France is beaten, so long as Germany does not take French territory as distinct from the colonies. From the material point of view, my right honorable friend, as he always does, used very temperate language, such a proposal is unacceptable, for France, without further territory in Europe being taken from her, could be so crushed as to lose her position as a great power, and become subordinate to German policy. That is the material aspect. But he proceeded, altogether, apart from that, it would be a disgrace for us to make this bargain with Germany at the expense of France, a disgrace from which the good name of this country would never recover. The Chancellor also, in effect, asks us to bargain away whatever obligation or interest we have as regards the neutrality of Belgium. We could not entertain that bargain either. He then says, we must preserve our full freedom to act, as circumstances may seem to us to require. And, he added, I think in sentences which the committee must appreciate, you should add most earnestly that the one way of maintaining the good relations between England and Germany is that they should continue to work together to preserve the peace of Europe. For that object, this government will work in that way with all sincerity and goodwill. If the peace of Europe can be preserved and the present crisis safely passed, my own endeavor will be to promote some arrangement to which Germany could be a party, by which she could be assured that no aggressive or hostile policy would be pursued against her or her allies by France, Russia, and ourselves, jointly or separately. I have desired this and worked for it. The statement was never more true. As far as I could, through the last Balkan crisis, and Germany having a corresponding object, our relations sensibly improved. The idea has hitherto been too utopian to form the subject of definite proposals. But if this present crisis, so much more acute than any that Europe has gone through for generations, be safely passed, I am hopeful that the relief and reaction which will follow may make possible some more definite rapprochement between the powers than has been possible hitherto. That document, in my opinion, states clearly, in temperate and convincing language, the attitude of this government. Can anyone who reads it fail to appreciate the tone of obvious sincerity and earnestness which underlies it? Can anyone honestly doubt that the government of this country, in spite of great provocation, and I regard the proposals made to us as proposals which we might have thrown aside without consideration and almost without answer, can anyone doubt that in spite of great provocation, the right honorable gentleman, who had already earned the title, and no one ever more deserved it, of Peacemaker of Europe, persisted to the very last moment of the last hour in that beneficent but unhappily frustrated purpose? I am entitled to say, and I do so on behalf of this country, I speak not for a party, I speak for the country as a whole, that we made every effort any government could possibly make for peace. But this war has been forced upon us. What is it we are fighting for? Everyone knows, and no one knows better than the government, the terrible, incalculable suffering, economic, social, personal, and political, which war, and especially a war between the great powers of the world, must entail. There is no man amongst us sitting upon this bench in these trying days, more trying perhaps than any body of statesmen for 100 years have had to pass through. There is not a man amongst us who has not, during the whole of that time, had clearly before his vision the almost unequaled suffering which war, even in a just cause, must bring about, not only to the peoples who are for the moment living in this country and in the other countries of the world, but to posterity and to the whole prospects of European civilization. Every step we took with that vision before our eyes, and with a sense of responsibility which it is impossible to describe. Unhappily, if in spite of all our efforts to keep the peace, and with that full and overpowering consciousness of the result, if the issue be decided in favor of war, we have, nevertheless, thought it to be the duty as well as the interest of this country to go to war, the House may be well assured it was because we believe, and I am certain the country will believe, that we are unsheathing our sword in a just cause. If I am asked what we are fighting for, I reply in 2 sentences. In the first place, to fulfill a solemn international obligation, an obligation which, if it had been entered into between private persons in the ordinary concerns of life, would have been regarded as an obligation not only of law, but of honor, which no self-respecting man could possibly have repudiated. I say, secondly, we are fighting to vindicate the principle which, in these days when force, material force, sometimes seems to be the dominant influence and factor in the development of mankind, we are fighting to vindicate the principle that small nationalities are not to be crushed, in defiance of international good faith, by the arbitrary will of a strong and overmastering power. I do not believe any nation ever entered into a great controversy, and this is one of the greatest history will ever know, with a clearer conscience and a stronger conviction that it is fighting not for aggression, not for the maintenance even of its own selfish interest, but that it is fighting in defense of principles the maintenance of which is vital to the civilization of the world. With a full conviction, not only of the wisdom and justice, but of the obligations which lay upon us to challenge this great issue, we are entering into the struggle. Let us now make sure that all the resources, not only of this United Kingdom, but of the vast empire of which it is the center, shall be thrown into the scale. And it is that object may be adequately secured that I am now about to ask this committee, to make the very unusual demand upon it, to give the government a vote of credit of £100 million. I am not going, and I am sure the committee do not wish it, into the technical distinctions between votes of credit and supplementary estimates and all the rarities and refinements which arise in that connection. There is a much higher point of view than that. If it were necessary, I could justify, upon purely technical grounds, the course we propose to adopt, but I am not going to do so, because I think it would be foreign to the temper and disposition of the committee. There is one thing to which I do call attention, that is, the title and heading of the bill. As a rule, in the past, votes of this kind have been taken simply for naval and military operations. But we have thought it right to ask the committee to give us its confidence in the extension of the traditional area of votes of credit, so that this money, which we are asking them to allow us to expend, may be applied not only for strictly naval and military operations, but to assist the food supplies, promote the continuance of trade, industry, business, and communications, whether by means of insurance or indemnity against risk or otherwise, for the relief of distress, and generally for all expenses arising out of the existence of a state of war. I believe the committee will agree with us that it was wise to extend the area of the vote of credit so as to include all these various matters. It gives the government a free hand. Of course, the Treasury will account for it, and any expenditure that takes place will be subject to the approval of the House. I think it would be a great pity, in fact, a great disaster, if, in a crisis of this magnitude, we were not enabled to make provision far more needed now than it was under the simpler conditions that prevailed in the old days, for all the various ramifications and developments of expenditure which the existence of a state of war between the great powers of Europe must entail on any one of them. I am asking also, in my character of Secretary of State for War, a position which I held until this morning, for a supplementary estimate for men for the Army. Perhaps the committee will allow me for a moment just to say on that personal matter that I took upon myself the office of Secretary of State for War under conditions, upon which I need not go back, but which are fresh in the minds of everyone, in the hope and with the object that the condition of things in the army, which all of us deplored, might speedily be brought to an end, and complete confidence re-established. I believe that is the case. In fact, I know it to be. There is no more loyal and united body, no body in which the spirit and habit of discipline are more deeply ingrained and cherished than in the British Army. Glad as I should have been to continue the work of that office, and I would have done so under normal conditions, it would not be fair to the Army, it would not be just to the country, that any minister should divide his attention between that department and another, still less that the First Minister of the Crown, who has to look into the affairs of all departments, and who is ultimately responsible for the whole policy of the Cabinet, should give, as he could only give, perfunctory attention to the affairs of our army in a great war. I am very glad to say that a very distinguished soldier and administrator, in the person of Lord Kitchener, with that great public spirit and patriotism that everyone would expect from him, at my request stepped into the breach. Lord Kitchener, as everyone knows, is not a politician. His association with the government as a member of the Cabinet for this purpose must not be taken as in any way identifying him with any set of political opinions. He has, at a great public emergency, responded to a great public call, and I am certain he will have with him, in the discharge of one of the most arduous tasks that has ever fallen upon a minister, the complete confidence of all parties and all opinions. I am asking, on his behalf for the army, power to increase the number of men of all ranks, in addition to the number already voted, by no less than 500,000. I am certain the committee will not refuse its sanction, for we are encouraged to ask for it not only by our own sense of the gravity and the necessities of the case, but by the knowledge that India is prepared to send us certainly 2 divisions, and that every one of our self-governing dominions, spontaneously and unasked, has already tendered to the utmost limits of their possibilities, both in men and in money, every help they can afford to the Empire in a moment of need. Sir, the mother country must set the example, while she responds with gratitude and affection to those filial overtures from the outlying members of her family. I will say no more. This is not an occasion for controversial discussion. In all that I have said, I believe I have not gone, either in the statement of our case or in my general description of the provision we think it necessary to make, beyond the strict bounds of truth. It is not my purpose, it is not the purpose of any patriotic man, to inflame feeling, to indulge in rhetoric, to excite international animosities. The occasion is far too grave for that. We have a great duty to perform. We have a great trust to fulfill. And confidently we believe that Parliament and the country will enable us to do it. End of speech. Recording by Daniel Vimont, Osaka, Japan.
Speech by Winston Churchill. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Speech given to the House of Commons on December 10th, 1936. The Abdication of King Edward VIII. Nothing is more certain or more obvious than that recrimination or controversy at this time would be not only useless but harmful and wrong. What is done is done. What has been done or left undone belongs to history, and to history, so far as I am concerned, it shall be left. I will, therefore, make two observations only. The first is this. It is clear, from what we have been told this afternoon, that there was at no time any constitutional issue between the King and his ministers, or between the King and Parliament. The supremacy of Parliament over the Crown, the duty of the sovereign to act in accordance with the advice of his ministers, neither of those was ever at any moment in question. Supporting my right honourable friend, the leader of the Liberal party, I venture to say that no sovereign has ever conformed more strictly or more faithfully to the letter and spirit of the Constitution than his present Majesty. In fact, he has voluntarily made a sacrifice for the peace and strength of his realm which goes far beyond the bounds required by the law and the Constitution. That is my first observation. My second is this. I have, throughout, pleaded for time. Anyone can see how grave would have been the evils of protracted controversy. On the other hand, it was, in my view, our duty to endure these evils even at serious inconvenience, if there was any hope that time would bring a solution. Whether there was any hope or not is a mystery which, at the present time, it is impossible to resolve. Time was also important from another point of view. It was essential that there should be no room for aspersions, after the event, that the King had been hurried in his decision. I believe that, if this decision had been taken last week, it could not have been declared that it was an unhurried decision, so far as the King himself was concerned. But now I accept wholeheartedly that the Prime Minister has proved, namely, that the decision taken this week has been taken by His Majesty freely, voluntarily, and spontaneously, in his own time and in his own way. As I have been looking at this matter, as is well known, from an angle different from that of most honourable members, I thought it my duty to place this fact also upon record. That is all I have to say upon the disputable part of this matter, but I hope the House will bear with me for a minute or two, because it was my duty as Home Secretary, more than a quarter of a century ago, to stand beside His present Majesty and proclaim his style and titles at his investiture as Prince of Wales amid the sunlit battlements of Carnarvon Castle. And ever since then he has honoured me here, and also in wartime, with his personal kindness and, I may even say, friendship. I should have been ashamed if, in my independent and unofficial position, I had not cast about for every lawful means, even the most forlorn, to keep him on the throne of his fathers, to which he only recently succeeded amid the hopes and prayers of all. In this prince there were discerned qualities of courage, of simplicity, of sympathy, and above all of sincerity, qualities rare and precious, which might have made his reign glorious in the annals of this ancient monarchy. It is the acme of tragedy that these very virtues should, in the private sphere, have led only to this melancholy and bitter conclusion. But, although our hopes today are withered, still I will assert that this personality will not go down uncherished to future ages, that it will be particularly remembered in the homes of his poor subjects, and that they will ever wish from the bottom of their hearts for his private peace and happiness, and for the happiness of those who are dear to him. I must say one more word, and I say it specially to those here and out of doors, and do not underrate their numbers, who are most poignantly afflicted by what has occurred. Danger gathers upon our path. We cannot afford, we have no right to look back. We must look forward. We must obey the exhortation of the Prime Minister to look forward. The stronger the advocate of the monarchical principle a man may be, the more zealously must he now endeavour to fortify the throne, and to give His Majesty's successor the strength which can only come from the love of a united nation and empire. End of speech. This recording by Ginger Kukula.
Speech by Winston Churchill. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniel Vimont. Speech given to the House of Commons on May 13, 1940, by Winston Churchill. I beg to move that this House welcomes the formation of a government representing the united and inflexible resolve of the nation to prosecute the war with Germany to a victorious conclusion. On Friday evening last, I received His Majesty's commission to form a new administration. It was the evident wish and will of Parliament and the nation that this should be conceived on the broadest possible basis, and that it should include all parties, both those who supported the late government and also the parties of the opposition. I have completed the most important part of this task. A war cabinet has been formed of 5 members, representing, with the opposition Liberals, the unity of the nation. The 3 party leaders have agreed to serve either in the War Cabinet or in high executive office. The 3 fighting services have been filled. It was necessary that this should be done in one single day on account of the extreme urgency and rigor of events. A number of other positions, key positions, were filled yesterday, and I am submitting a further list to His Majesty tonight. I hope to complete the appointment of the principal ministers during tomorrow. The appointment of the other ministers usually takes a little longer, but I trust that, when Parliament meets again, this part of my task will be completed, and that the administration will be complete in all respects. I considered it in the public interest to suggest that the House should be summoned to meet today. Mr. Speaker agreed, and took the necessary steps, in accordance with the powers conferred upon him by the resolution of the House. At the end of the proceedings today, the adjournment of the House will be proposed until Tuesday, 21st May, with, of course, provision for earlier meeting if need be. The business to be considered during that week will be notified to members at the earliest opportunity. I now invite the House, by the motion which stands in my name, to record its approval of the steps taken and to declare its confidence in the new government. To form an administration of this scale and complexity is a serious undertaking in itself. But it must be remembered that we are in the preliminary stage of one of the greatest battles in history, that we are in action at many other points in Norway and in Holland, that we have to be prepared in the Mediterranean, that the air battle is continuous, and that many preparations, such as have been indicated by my honorable friend below the gangway, have to be made here, at home. In this crisis, I hope I may be pardoned if I do not address the House at any length today. I hope that any of my friends and colleagues, or former colleagues, who are affected by the political reconstruction, will make allowance, all allowance, for any lack of ceremony with which it has been necessary to act. I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined this government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war, by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire. No survival for all that the British Empire has stood for. No survival for the urgent impulse of the ages that mankind will move forward towards its goal. But I take up my task with buoyancy and hope. I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. At this time, I feel entitled to claim the aid of all. And I say, come then. Let us go forward together with our united strength. End of speech. Recording by Daniel Vimont, Osaka, Japan.
Speech by Barbara Castle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Speech given to the House of Commons on the 1st of July 1952 by Barbara Castle. The Honourable Member for Heeley, Mr. P. Roberts, has made a very important speech because he has been telling us that the reason why we must accept the use of force in Korea to settle negotiations is because it is the only thing which the Chinese will heed, as they do not genuinely want the negotiations to succeed on any reasonable kind of basis. The Honourable Member's argument was that we therefore have to go on battering the Communists with all of the military force at our command as the only way of settling the situation in Korea. I suggest that the Honourable Member is distorting the whole history of the Korean War when he makes that statement. Indeed, during this debate, and on other occasions in this House, it has always been the assumption of honourable and right honourable gentlemen opposite that all the sweet reasonableness has come from the side of the United Nations, that there have been no mistakes on our side, no evidence of good intentions on the side of the enemy, and that, therefore, we must in righteousness continue, however reluctantly, to batter them. If anyone studies the course of the Korean War objectively, as I have tried to do, and as I had reason to do as a member of the British delegation to the United Nations on 2 occasions, on one of which Korea was a very live issue, he will feel, as I feel, a grave sense of responsibility about it. If we study the course of events objectively, we will find a background very different from the one which the Honourable Member has pictured to us. What we have had in Korea has been a seesaw battle of military forces, as a result of which, at various points, there have been opportunities for a ceasefire, some of which, in my view, the United Nations has neglected to the peril of the peace of the world. We all know how dramatic the changes were in the military fortunes of this war. First, in August 1950, the United Nations forces were pushed down to the Pusan bridgehead, when we all thought they would be swept into the sea. Then came a dramatic reversal of fortunes, and the United Nations forces swept triumphantly northward across the 38th parallel, across the bottleneck and up to the Yalu River. General MacArthur was boasting that his troops would be home by Christmas, but as a result of that drive north being carried too far, he brought the Chinese forces into the war, and by Christmas, instead of being home, his forces were back at the 38th parallel. It was at that point that the first opportunity for ceasefire negotiations occurred. It is a great pity that, thanks to the lack of firmness of ourselves, among others, that opportunity was not properly exploited at a time when there was an overwhelming feeling in the United Nations that an opportunity was there and could be exploited. With China in the war, everybody knew that from that moment we were handling dynamite, and many nations had an uneasy feeling that there was responsibility on the United Nations forces for the fact that China had ever been brought into the war, that she had suffered great provocation, and had obviously come in with the greatest reluctance. At that time, when General Wu went to New York, there was some evidence of genuine goodwill on the part of China. Suspicion too, yes, but who could blame her? Suspicion as great as there was on the side of the Americans, but definite evidence of a willingness to make a response to any genuinely friendly approaches that were made to her. It was at that time that a move was started in the United Nations to get a ceasefire, and a ceasefire committee of 3, consisting of representatives of India, Canada and Iran, were given the task of examining the possibilities. They discussed them with the Peking representatives. At that time Peking's attitude, not altogether unreasonably, was, "We will not have a ceasefire until we have had political talks. If we have ceasefire talks first, all that will happen will be that the Americans will use the opportunity to build up their strength to give us a knockout blow. Let us have a settlement of the Far Eastern political problems before we start talking about a ceasefire." There was a not unnatural feeling of anxiety on the part of China to protect her forces, such as we feel for our own troops. When we feel it, it is common sense, but when China feels it, that is sinister manoeuvring. The 3 delegates of India, Canada and Iran, with great patience and some optimism, proceeded with their talks, and got the Chinese to the point of saying, "If a 7-power conference can be called to discuss a political settlement, we will agree to put the item of the ceasefire talks at the head of the agenda." Many members of the United Nations believed that this offered a real chance of closing the gap between the 2 points of view. Let us be honest. I know I shall be accused of being anti-American, but do not let us make truth a casualty in peace as well as in war. It was the attitude of the United States which made it impossible for that Chinese response to be followed up, because the United States had placed on the agenda of the United Nations a resolution to brand China as an aggressor in order to score a moral victory over her. All the sane voices in the world, who had not been irretrievably lined up in the 2 blocks, urged that we should be careful not to pursue the hollowness of a moral victory at the price of failures of substance in other directions. It was a tragedy at that time that once again, following the arguments we have heard this afternoon, that we must not break with the Americans and must not do anything to break up this great Anglo-American alliance, which is the guarantee of the peace of the world, Britain reluctantly, and, in my view, most mistakenly, with the gravest misgivings on the part of everyone who knew what was involved, and in face of grave warnings from India as to the effects of this on the possibility of a settlement, supported that resolution branding China as an aggressor. From that moment, every possibility of the ceasefire talks succeeding came to an end, and shortly afterwards the United Nations started a new advance. In the spring of 1951, once again they crossed the 38th parallel. But the Communists, again not through any excess of original sin, but merely with the human desire to protect themselves, struck back, and our forces were driven south again. It was because the military forces of the 2 sides were deadlocked in a military stalemate around the 38th parallel that Mr. Mallock's proposal for a ceasefire was broached and was accepted. We shall fool ourselves if we believe that these ceasefire negotiations started out of a military victory by the United Nations. They started out of a military stalemate. Thank heaven everyone had the sense to seize the opportunity to try to end that military stalemate. But that is the fact, and from that moment the long, sorry story of the ceasefire negotiations started. We must recognise, if we are to deal with objective historical facts, that time and again the Chinese, whatever their faults, did make concessions. They made a very important concession in abandoning the attitude they had taken up in New York a few months earlier, that there must be a political conference before ceasefire talks were held, they made a very important concession there. Very shortly afterwards, they made another important concession. Instead of insisting that the ceasefire line should be the 38th parallel, which was what they wanted in order to save face, it had great moral significance for them. They agreed, after long argument of course, that the ceasefire line should be fixed at the actual battlefront. At that time, one of the United Nations spokesmen in Korea said that was a big step forward, the biggest I have seen. It was a concession by the Chinese. Do not let us run away from that fact. But, so obsessed have the United Nations representatives been all the time with the concept of winning by force, of battering the enemy into submission, that every concession by the Chinese has been greeted by the United Nations command, not as evidence that a rapprochement with China might be possible, but by the suggestion, "She is weak, boys, put the pressure on, she will have to go back further still." After this great step forward had been made, there was a shock not only to left-wing opinion in this House, but to American journalistic opinion, to British journalistic opinion, and to the soldiers in Korea, at a sudden change in the negotiators' attitude. The UN negotiators suddenly said, "We cannot fix the ceasefire line now at all. It cannot be fixed till the armistice talks have ended." This was a change in their whole attitude. I wonder whether honourable members have forgotten the storm which took place in the British press at that time, when men like Stephen Barber of the News Chronicle came out with stories such as the one published on 14th of November 1951, and headed, "Korea, why this muddle?" They said that the soldiers had been astonished by the sudden change in ground by the United Nations negotiators in the light of the concessions the Chinese had made. This is what the News Chronicle correspondent said. This kind of thing, coupled with evasiveness in answering correspondents' questions, and such remarks as General Nucall's, "We insist but we are not adamant," have led many US journalists as well as other UN nationals to wonder just how much sincerity there is here. This confusion even penetrated to the New York press, which said that the American soldiers were alarmed at the apparent lack of sincerity in the negotiations, and at the idea of keeping up the battle pressure, about which their generals were talking, at a time when the men were more preoccupied with getting the matter settled so that they could get home. I therefore ask the House, at this very serious time in international affairs, and in view of the consequences that are involved in our discussions, to realise that there have been grave faults on the part of our own negotiators in the United Nations as well as on the part of the Chinese. They are faults which, in my view, spring from the fact that increasingly, while the rest of the world has been willing to keep the door open for a political settlement in the Far East, America has been steadily closing the door and increasingly substituting for a policy of negotiation, a policy of building a ring of military might around the Chinese people and the Russian people until they reach a point at which they have to accept her terms. We know how greatly the American policy has changed during this time, and how President Truman's brave remarks at the outbreak of the Korean War that Formosa was to be neutralized have given way gradually to a situation in which, openly and flagrantly, Chiang Kai-shek has been installed in Formosa as a base from which he is planning counter-revolution in China. We have had articles in the most responsible newspapers in Great Britain describing quite coolly, none of us turns a hair, how he is setting up his revolution implementation institutes there, and we have seen articles in the Manchester Guardian of how he has been preparing for the invasion of the Chinese mainland when the possibility of peaceful settlement with the Chinese government has broken down. Then again, how can we believe that the settlement of the Korean issue has been made more possible by the conclusion of the Japanese peace treaty on the basis of the most cold-blooded exclusion of China from her rightful place in Far Eastern affairs? The treaty was rushed through for purely military reasons. The suggestion is, never mind if we are encouraging reactionary elements in Japan who will scrap the new labour code and the legislation against the re-emergence of the old Japanese trusts. The important thing is that they should recognise Chang and not Peking. Never mind about the political content of the policy, build up military might. Some of us are profoundly anxious about these developments. Now we are being asked to become silent accessories to a policy which is purely military in content, and it will inevitably follow that if we have a political vacuum, the military men will come in with their atom bombs. Some curious things have happened. What about the sudden blowing up of atrocity stories? That was very mysterious, but we do not hear any more about it now. Why did it ever have to be launched? We had Colonel Hanley, the Judge Advocate of the 8th Army, startling the world last November by saying that 13,000 United Nations troops in Korea, including 10 British soldiers, had been murdered by the Communists since the war started. Washington said, "We have not heard anything about it." That was another example of a mysterious lack of information and of a lack of consultation between the State Department and the military men on the spot. There were supposed to be British soldiers involved, but there was a flat denial in this House of any evidence that any British soldier was involved. We had Mr. R.M. McColl saying in the Daily Express that the effect of that in America had been to create the massacre mood, and that Senator Taft had said that he was now in favour of using atom weapons on the battlefield. An honourable member interjected, "What about the germ warfare charge?" I am not approving that kind of story either, but what I would point out is that we started this kind of talk. The first atrocity story came from our side. I am not saying that we are black and they are all white. I am suggesting that we should realise that we may both be grey. Both sides may have made mistakes, and it is imperative for the peace of the world that we stop striking moral postures. Above all, we should look at this new development which has resulted from the recent raids, and ask ourselves what it means. What does it mean? Suddenly, at a moment when there is only one issue left in the armistice talks, when the weary months of talks are at last beginning to bear fruit, when the Foreign Secretary tells us he is hopeful about the outcome of the armistice talks, and when the only matter at issue between us and the Communists is one on which we are on very delicate ground, we have the United Nations Command suddenly turning on the military pressure with new ferocity. Yet there are people on both sides of this House who are not satisfied that we have handled the prisoner of war question properly. Then there was a recent article in the Daily Mail by Walter Lippmann, the American commentator, headed "The Koji Trouble Could Have Been Avoided," in which he analysed the business of the screening. Although he stood firmly by the view that there should be no sending back of genuine political refugees against their will, he maintained that the way in which the questions had been framed and put to the prisoners could only have led to one result, that instead of it being a case of our being willing to grant asylum to genuine political refugees in extreme circumstances, it was rather a case of an open invitation to those who wished to find an easy way out of some of their difficulties. Reading the White Paper and the questions put to the prisoners, I must say I found no ground for doubting that Walter Lippmann was representing objective and sane opinion when he deplored the way in which this business has been handled. He points out that the vitally important questions put to the prisoners during the screening were not drawn up by those with experience of that sort of thing in the last war, but were left to the military chaps on the spot. He said that we ought to submit every one of the cases of those refusing repatriation to an impartial tribunal, and not leave the decision to the so-called impartial screeners, who were merely officers in the United States Army. He is an American who is prepared to say that. May not it be that on this issue we are wrong, or at any rate partly wrong? Is this the moment when we should threaten the peace of the world by sending 500 planes to bomb plants which had not been bombed before, simply because it was considered to be politically dangerous to do it? Is this the moment at which we should choose to be so provocative? If the Prime Minister does not draw any horrifying conclusion from this raid, he is about the only person left in the country who is not shocked to the core. The New York Times has no doubt about the significance of this raid, none whatever. It pointed out that it was the largest raid since the end of the Second World War. The largest raid, and this at a time when the armistice negotiations are being brought to a conclusion. What kind of insanity is this? And we have now on the front bench opposite a government who are complacent about it to the point of approval. As I heard the speech of the Prime Minister, I could only draw one conclusion, which was that the terms of this motion we shall vote on tonight are much too limited. It is perfectly clear that if we were to get the machinery of consultation for which we ask, the Prime Minister of this country would merely use it to agree with everything that America said. We used to think of him as a bulldog sitting on the Union Jack. He has become a lapdog sitting on the Stars and Stripes of America. I would leave the House with a word of warning. We are only at the beginning of a new phase of policy in Korea. We are only at the beginning of another attempt by the Americans to fill up the political vacuum with military might, something they have done before with dangerous possibilities. I would ask honourable members to read the very serious article in the New York Times of 26th of June, written by Hanson W. Baldwin. He has no doubt at all that this is a new phase of the war. He says, "These raids are definitely a first step of a programme to bring greater military pressure upon the enemy to force a ceasefire." And goes on, "The second step in this programme may be attacks on Nanjing and the vital rail link that connects this port to the Soviet Union. And the third step, already in effect in a small way, is increased ground pressure against the enemy." Then he adds, "If these measures are not successful in forcing a peace, the additional measures transcend the narrow geographic frame of Korea. They include not only a naval blockade of China and bombing of the enemy's Manchurian and Chinese air bases, but political and diplomatic actions in the United Nations and elsewhere. Whether they will ever be taken depends, however, upon the repercussions of the power plant bombings and upon political events in the United States between now and November." That is a very tenuous thread on which to hang the peace of the world. Certainly he has no doubt as to the logical consequences of the development of the policy we are being asked to condone here this evening. It leads, with a dreadful logic, step by step, to what we have said in this House we would not be prepared to accept. The Prime Minister went to Washington to cement Anglo-American relations, and promised prompt, resolute and effective action to the Americans. He promised it only on the grounds that a truce had been concluded and deliberately violated by the enemy. Now we are being asked to carry out similar action not when the Chinese are aggressive, but when they are passive. Their only crime now is that they are standing still. We in this country, if we gave the lead, could have a profound and salutary effect upon American policy without doing any harm to the cause of Western unity. Indeed, when General MacArthur was sacked, President Truman went on the air and told the American people that MacArthur's policy had been threatening the unity of the West and endangering America's alliance with the West. It had been threatening to leave America isolated. I believe that the Americans would listen if only we had a voice with which to speak. Unfortunately, never has the influence of this country been so low in world affairs as it is at present. The Right Honourable Gentleman the Prime Minister did not speak for Britain tonight. I ask the House to see that by passing this motion, the voice of Britain is not silenced at this hour. End of speech. Recording by Cori Samuel. Speech by Margaret Thatcher. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Speech given to the House of Commons on the 5th of February 1960 by Margaret Thatcher. I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. This is a maiden speech, but I know that the constituency of Finchley, which I have the honour to represent, would not wish me to do other than come straight to the point and address myself to the matter before the House. I cannot do better than begin by stating the objects of the bill in the words used by Mr. Arthur Henderson when he introduced the bill which became the Local Authorities Admission of the Press to Meetings Act 1908, which was also a private member's measure. He specified the object and purpose as that of guarding the rights of members of the public by enabling the fullest information to be obtained for them in regard to the actions of their representatives upon local authorities. It is appropriate at this stage to mention that the public does not have a right of admission, either at common law or by statute, to the meetings of local authorities. Members of the public are compelled, therefore, to rely upon the local press for information on what their elected representatives are doing. The original measure was brought as a result of a case in which the representatives of a particular paper were excluded from a particular meeting. The public has the right, in the first instance, to know what its elected representatives are doing. That right extends in a number of directions. I do not know whether honourable members generally appreciate the total amount of money spent by local authorities. In England and Wales, local authorities spend £1,400 million a year, and in Scotland just over £200 million a year. These sums are not insignificant, even in terms of national budgets. Less than half is raised by ratepayers' money, and the rest by taxpayers' money, and the first purpose in admitting the press is that we may know how those monies are being spent. In the second place, I quote from the report of the Franks Committee. Publicity is the greatest and most effective check against any arbitrary action. That is one of the fundamental rights of the subject. Further, publicity stimulates the interest of local persons in local government. That is also very important. But if there is a case for publicity, there is also a case for a certain amount of private conference when personal matters are being discussed and when questions are in a preliminary stage. It is in trying to find a point of balance between these two aspects, the public right of knowledge and the necessity on occasion for private conference, that the difficulty arises. An attempt was made by the 1908 Act to meet this difficulty, and I now turn to the history of the measure which I am about to present. Provision was made by the 1908 Act for press representatives to attend meetings of local councils and meetings of education committees, insofar as they had delegated powers, and also a number of other bodies which have now ceased to exist because successive parliaments have substituted new bodies to carry out the powers which the 1908 Act formally permitted the press to publicise. Long before the events of the past summer, there was a very good case for amending the 1908 Act. The first good case arose when the Local Government Act, 1929, abolished boards of guardians, to whose meetings the Act admitted the press. Boards of guardians were responsible for the administration of hospitals and many other matters. The first attempt to bring the law of 1908 up to date came in 1930, when the Right Honourable Member for South Shields, Mr. Ede, introduced a private member's measure, which I am happy and relieved to learn received a second reading. It did not get any further because of a rather precipitate change of government, which I do not think even the most optimistic honourable member opposite would believe was imminent at the moment. The case for the bill, then, was that boards of guardians no longer existed, and the Act needed amending, firstly by reference to its past performance, and secondly by reference to the new legislation of 1929. Then came another major local government measure, the Local Government Act 1933. That Act has very considerable significance, because in Section 85, local authorities were empowered to appoint any committees they chose. As a result, many authorities began to go into committee of the full council, not merely for the purpose which is in the spirit of the 1908 Act, that is to say, in order to discuss something which was truly of a confidential nature, but in order merely to exclude the press, without addressing their minds to whether such exclusion was justified by reference to the matter to be discussed. That began to provide the first major legal loophole in the Act. Where previously local authorities had to deliberate in open council, with the exception of circumstances arising from the business which justified the exclusion of the press, after that Act they were enabled to resolve themselves into committee merely as a matter of administrative convenience. 2 more private members' measures attempted to bring the 1908 Act up to date. One introduced in 1949 by the Honourable Member for Westbury, Sir R. Grimston, and the other introduced in 1950 by the Honourable Member for Solihull, Mr. M. Lindsay. In the meantime, the need was becoming even greater, because in 1944 came the Education Act, which removed from the sharp light of publicity education committees which had been within purview of the 1908 Act. So we find that the purpose of this Act, which governs the position now, is no longer effective, because its provisions have become greatly outdated. This is one of the major grounds for attempting now to bring the 1908 Act up to date and make its purpose effective by means of a new Act. I now turn to the bill before the House, and will try to deduce its general principle from the clauses there set down. There are 6 points I should like to make. The first point is, on what occasions in local authority work will this bill entitle the press to be present? I use the word entitled because there are many authorities which already practice the admission of the press to a far greater extent than the bill would necessitate their doing if it became law. This is meant to establish a minimum legislative code of practice for the local authorities. Therefore, the first question is to which meetings of local authorities would the press be entitled to be admitted by virtue of the bill? I would refer honourable members to Clause 2.2, which contains the major point with reference to committees, and I will try to put the point in fairly simple language, rather simpler than the complicated drafting we find here. May I point out that committees of local authorities whose only power is to recommend a course of action to the Council, a course of action which must be taken by the Council, and which cannot be taken by the committee without reference back, are not included at all in the bill. Therefore, any committee of a local authority, whose only task is to recommend a course of action to the Council, is not within the purview of the bill. I am well aware that a number of committees of local authorities have 2 different kinds of power: power to recommend, and power to discharge the function of the local authority itself, because that local authority has specifically delegated that task to the committee. Where the committee has both of these functions, it comes within the realm of the bill, if, and only if, a substantial part of its functions consists in discharging delegated powers. Where a committee only has the odd delegated power referred to it, it will not come within the bill. Where local authorities have made a practice, as some have, of delegating their own functions to committees, these committees have substantial delegated powers, and therefore come within this clause. The press will be admitted to the main council meetings of local authorities, and to those meetings which effectively discharge the functions of the council, that is, the committees with substantial delegated powers, but others are not included. I know that some authorities include them, and I would like to see more authorities include them, because I think it would be in the interests of local government, but they are not entitled to be included under this bill. Having got the press into these meetings, or having entitled them to be in, there must inevitably be occasions, such as personal circumstances coming under discussion, matters preliminary to legal proceedings, matters with regard to the acquisition of land, or such matters which would inevitably come up, when the press were entitled to be present, unless some effective provision was made to exclude the press on these occasions. My second point, therefore, is, having got the press in, upon what grounds is a local authority entitled to exclude it? There must inevitably be some occasions. We have had great difficulty in drafting the clause to fit all cases. I had hoped to draw up a schedule of circumstances in which local authorities would be entitled to exclude the press. That was not possible, and we have had to go back to a kind of omnibus clause. I refer honourable members to Clause 1.2, which is the operative clause for this purpose. I suggest most earnestly that when the press is excluded, it must be because of some particular reason arising from the proceedings of the local authority at the time, and there must be very good reason for the exclusion. The real reason for excluding the press is that publicity of the matter to be discussed would be prejudicial to the public interest. There are 2 prongs to this clause. Publicity would be prejudicial for 2 main groups of reasons. The first group is where the matters under discussion are of a confidential nature. They may relate to personal circumstances of individual electors. They may relate to a confidential communication from a government department asking local authorities for their opinion on a subject which the minister would not like to be discussed in open session until he is a good deal further on and has received the views of local authorities. There is another group of subjects which perhaps could not be strictly termed confidential, but where it would be clearly prejudicial to the public interest to discuss them in open session. They may relate to staff matters, to legal proceedings, to contracts, the discussion of which tender to accept, and other such matters. On this prong, the press has to be excluded for a special reason, which would need to be stated in the resolution for exclusion. Where the matter is confidential, it would not need to be specified further in the resolution for exclusion. Where it was for a special reason, that reason would need to be specified in broad general terms in the resolution for exclusion. This subsection is effective and wide enough in its drafting to cover all occasions upon which a local authority could possibly have good grounds for going into private session. Those are the two main operative clauses of the bill. My third point relates to documents. I understand that there is a very wide variation in practice between the number of documents which different local authorities give to the press. I do not know how many honourable members have tried to obtain information about a local authority of which they are not a member, but happen to be a ratepayer. One sometimes goes to a council meeting without any idea of what is to be discussed. One sits there for about 15 minutes, and all one hears is numbers being counted up to about 20, and starting all over again. Unless the press, which is to report to the public, has some idea from the documents before it what is to be discussed, the business of allowing the press in becomes wholly abortive. Therefore, Clause 1, 3b, makes provision for a limited number of documents to be supplied to the press at its request in advance of the meeting. It specifies that the agenda must be supplied to the press if it so requests, and is prepared to pay for it. Agendas vary very much. Some are couched in terms which do not betray for one moment the subject which is to be discussed. One sees such items as, to discuss the proposal of Mr. Smith, and to receive the recommendation of Mr. Jones. As distinct from the supporting accompanying documents, the agenda itself is usually a comparatively brief document. I have, therefore, thought fit to put into the subsection a provision that the agenda shall be supplied to the press together with such further statement or particulars as are necessary to convey to an outside person the nature of the subject to be discussed. Therefore, the press must have some idea from the documents what is the true subject to be discussed at meetings to which its representatives are entitled to be admitted. If the whole agenda was supplied, it might include some things which would be likely to be taken when the press was excluded. I understand that the practice, in many councils, is to have Part 1 and Part 2, to take subjects in public session first, and to then have a resolution and go into camera for the next group of subjects which come up in private. The corporation, acting through its proper officer, to whom it would have to give instructions, is entitled to exclude from the agenda matters which are likely to be taken in camera, so that no confidential matters will leak out by that process. Another provision in the clause is that the corporation may, if it thinks fit, not must, include supporting committee reports or documents, but it would have to exercise its mind to include them. The press would not be able to demand such documents as of right. Fourthly, I have been approached and asked about the question of qualified privilege for local councillors and people who serve on local authorities. I have been approached by people who suggest that the privilege should be made absolute. I could not possibly accede to that, as I think that absolute privilege should be given very rarely indeed. However, there is a consequential provision in the bill which means that where qualified privilege at present exists for statements made by people serving on local authorities, that qualified privilege shall not cease to exist merely because the press is present. That retains the present position, and removes one of the reasons why people can object to the press being present, because unless there were a consequential provision, it might serve to remove the qualified privilege. Fifthly, I understand from various sources that my proposals are under some criticism because they contain no sanctions or penalties upon local authorities. I should therefore like to state briefly what I am advised the position is when any statute is breached. There are general sanctions available at law for this purpose. Where a public right is infringed, as it would be in the event of the bill becoming law and local authorities wrongfully excluding the press, any person can apply to either the Attorney General or the Solicitor General for what is known as a relator action. He must state on the application the grounds, and enclose counsel's opinion that there is a good cause of action, that is to say, that it is probable that the counsel wrongfully excluded under particular circumstances. The person must supply also, I have no doubt that this is very important, a solicitor's certificate to the effect that the person to take action and to go to the courts is a person who is likely to be able to meet the costs, because the Attorney General will not foot the bill, he only lends his name to the action. When that is done, the courts can adjudicate on whether that exclusion was legal or illegal. In the event of the litigant getting a declaration that the exclusion was illegal, he would get costs, and the district auditor already has power to surcharge those costs upon the members of the local authority whose misconduct was responsible for the illegal action occurring. I submit that those sanctions that are available by the ordinary law are sufficient to enable this measure to be enforced. My sixth point relates to the schedule. I shall not go through the schedule in any great detail, except to point out that a considerable number of the bodies referred to in it are the successors in title to those mentioned in the 1908 Act, the divisional executives established under the Education Act, the regional hospital boards, and so on. Honourable members will note that some committees of authorities are specifically excluded, those whose functions consist solely of determining matters of a confidential nature. For example, committees of regional hospitals boards are specifically excluded. Committees of executive councils are specifically excluded, which means that any disciplinary matter relating to doctors, nurses, and so on would not come before the public eye, because the committee discharging the function does not come within this measure. I hope it is evident from what I have said that we are trying very hard to put into the form of legislation a code of practice that will safeguard the rights of the public. There was, last summer, one instance of the letter of the 1908 Act being contravened, and in a number of instances certainly the spirit of that Act was contravened. It is not, therefore, only a matter of bringing the 1908 Act up to date. Because of the abuse of the law, there is a case for safeguarding the rights of the citizen. I hope that honourable members will think it fit to give this bill a second reading, and to consider that the paramount function of this distinguished House is to safeguard civil liberties, rather than to think that administrative convenience should take first place in law. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I should like to acknowledge the help given to me by my right honourable friend and his department, which, I understand, has been as great as any government department could give to a private member. I also want to acknowledge the help of those who have been good enough to subscribe their names to the bill, and I should like to thank the House for its very kind indulgence to a new member. End of speech. Recording by Cori Samuel, March 2012.
Speech by Michael Foote. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Mills. Speech given to the House of Commons on 13th December 1960 by Michael Foote. If it is the case that the government are accepting these proposals, or are to back them, and therefore the NATO alliance, according to my right honourable friend's definition, will become more provocative than deterrent, then that surely will be a very serious situation. The Minister of Defence tried to slur it over. It is a serious and dangerous proposition, partly because of the military reasons already advanced, but partly for political reasons. Think of the timing of it. What an ironic disaster it would be if the response of the West to the new developments that have been taking place in the East, the meeting in Moscow, is an intensification of the arms race in Europe, on a scale which, as my right honourable friend says, would make the NATO alliance more provocative than deterrent. What an appalling way it would be of dealing with this new international situation. Moreover, this proposal cuts across what I think to be the simplest, the most intelligent and the most workable proposal which has come from the East to the West over the years, the Rapaki Plan. This was a plan for keeping nuclear weapons out of a nuclear-free zone before nuclear weapons were put there. The American government turned it down flat, and the British government followed suit because, they said, it would not deal with conventional weapons. When the Polish government said that it would bring into the plan later proposals for controlling conventional weapons, that also was turned down flat. Yet if we are to go ahead with the proposals for putting these Polaris machines all over Europe, or stuffing Europe with more and more nuclear weapons, then it will be very difficult to retrace our steps back to the point when the Rapaki plan was put forward. Which does Europe want? The Rapaki plan or the Norstad plan? Members opposite may say that they want the Norstad plan. If that is so, they are voting and working for, and are eager to see, an intensification of the arms race in Europe, because that is what the Norstad proposals really mean. They cannot deny the simple fact that if they pile more and more weapons into Europe, they will increase the pace of the arms race. If we pile more into Western Europe, the Communists will pile more into Eastern Europe, and that will increase the pace of the arms race. The question is whether we are to halt that state of affairs. Time and again, in the difficulties which the world has had in dealing with this problem, there seems to have been no intelligent balance made between the assumed military risks of causing a halt in the arms race and the undoubted political risks of forcing the pace. Those of us who believe in nuclear disarmament believe that part of the reason for this failure is the fatalistic obsession with the nuclear strategy. If honourable members cherish the great deterrent, if they say, as the Prime Minister says, that the maintenance of the credibility of the deterrent must take precedence over all other claims, then political judgment becomes clouded. Many countries do not have nuclear bases on their soil, and do not have this obsession with sustained nuclear armaments, and they make saner and wiser contributions in the councils of the world than we do. That is one of the reasons why some of us are in favour of getting rid of these weapons. But of course, although we would like to see the repudiation of this strategy altogether, that does not mean that we would not welcome a retreat from it as a start. Therefore, if the government, instead of going to Paris to support these proposals, as the Minister said today that they intended to do, said instead that they would call a halt now, particularly in view of the factors in the international situation described by my right honourable friend, they would be giving a lead to Europe. But they cannot do that, partly because they have already accepted Polaris. It is not much use the Minister of Defence going to Paris and saying that the government do not want the others to have Polaris in Europe, while we are to have it in Holy Loch. When the Prime Minister made his agreement about Polaris in the United States, did he know about all these later proposals for putting these machines all over Europe? Had he considered the political implications? Had he considered that it would mean a new screw in the arms race? That it would make negotiations more difficult? That he would be once more slamming the door on the possibility of opening negotiations? Those of us who think that we can negotiate have put down an amendment to the motion, and we have every right to do so. As I said when my right honourable friends on the front bench complained about our putting down this amendment, it tries to outline our idea of repudiating the nuclear strategy. They have no right to complain, because, when they put down their motion, it was one which no one who supported the new policy decided at Scarborough could possibly vote for. I think that my right honourable friend the Leader of the Opposition will be able to clear up this matter very well when he comes to reply, because I am sure that he will say that his motion is absolutely consistent with the defence policy which he subscribed to before, and fits in with the strategy he himself outlined of fighting against the Scarborough decision of the Labour Party. The matter can be cleared up in that way. The rest of us are going to go on expressing our ideas. So long as we look at this scene and witness the insanities induced by the nuclear strategy, so long as we see influence over our affairs progressively removed from democratic assemblies, so long as we see the command over our policies removed to another nation, one which has surrendered a great deal of civilian power into military hands, so long as we see the military Frankensteins assuming authority not merely to dictate defence programmes, but also foreign policy, the more we will be convinced that there is no military way of checking these dangers, much less a military solution for them. The only solution to this problem lies in the field of foreign policy, but our possibilities of developing a new foreign policy are stultified by our defence policy, and by our increasing reliance for the preeminent weapons on another nation. That prevents us from having the foreign policy that might provide the only solution. But fortunately for the honour of this country, there is a great and growing number of people throughout the land who are protesting against the policies pursued by the government, sometimes supported by the official opposition, who are protesting against the suffocation of democratic responsibilities which goes on in this matter, and they have every right to do so. We who agree with their views have every right, and indeed every duty, to state our views on the floor of this House, the most famous parliamentary assembly in the world. End of speech.